Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Marcus Brennan, but everyone calls me Mac. I've been a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 18 years now, just like my daddy and his daddy before him. These mountains are in my blood, every ridge, every hollow, every creek that cuts through the ancient stone. I know where the old Cherokee trails wind up the mountainsides and where the moonshiners used to hide their stills back in my granddaddy's time. It was late October of 1974 when everything changed. The leaves had turned brilliant orange and red, painting the mountains like God's own watercolor. Hunting season was just starting, and the morning mist hung thick in the valleys like cotton batting. I was working my usual patrol in the backcountry when the call came over my radio. "Mac, we got a problem," crackled the voice of my supervisor, Jim Parker. "3 hunters didn't come back last night. Their wives are worried sick." I grabbed my notepad from the dashboard of my green Park Service truck. "Give me the details, Jim." "Names are Bobby Hutchins, Dale Morrison, and Carl Weaver. All from Knoxville. Experienced hunters. Been coming up here for years. They were supposed to be camping near White Oak Sink." My stomach tightened a little. White Oak Sink was one of those places that made even old-timers like me feel uneasy. It was a deep, bowl-shaped valley surrounded by steep ridges, about 15 miles from the nearest paved road. The Cherokee used to call it a bad place, though nobody remembers exactly why anymore. "When did they check in last?" I asked. 2 days ago at the ranger station. Said they'd be back by yesterday evening." I looked at my watch. It was already past noon. If these men had been missing since yesterday, every hour that passed made things worse. The October nights got cold up in the high country, cold enough to kill a man if he wasn't prepared. "I'm heading out now," I told Jay. "Bien, monsieur. Radio me if you hear anything." I loaded my truck with extra supplies, first aid kit, emergency blankets, flares, and my old Vietnam-era field radio for when I got too deep into the mountains for the regular radio to work. I'd learned the hard way that the Smokies could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. The drive to the trailhead took 40 minutes on winding mountain roads. I parked at the end of a gravel logging road and shouldered my pack. The temperature was already dropping, and thick gray clouds were building over the ridges. Weather was coming in. I could smell it in the air. I hiked for 2 hours through dense hardwood forest, following an old game trail that wound down into White Oak Sink. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. That should have been my first warning. October in the Smokies should be alive with sound. Squirrels chattering, birds calling, leaves rustling in the breeze. But as I descended into the hollow, it was like someone had turned down the volume on the whole world. I found their camp just as the sun was starting to set behind the western ridge. 3 orange tents arranged in a neat triangle around a stone fire ring. Their gear was still there. Sleeping bags, food, even a pot of coffee sitting on the cold ashes of their fire. The coffee was still warm. That made my skin crawl. "Who leaves warm coffee behind?" I called out their names, my voice echoing off the steep hillsides. "Bobby, Dale, Carl." But there was no answer, just my own voice bouncing back at me like a mockery. I examined their campsite carefully, the way my daddy taught me when I was just a boy. There were no signs of a struggle. No torn fabric, no scattered gear, no blood. Their hunting rifles were still leaning against an oak tree. Nobody goes hunting without their guns, especially not experienced hunters like these were supposed to be. The fire ring told an interesting G-story. The ashes were cold, but arranged in a perfect circle. Too perfect. It looked like someone had smoothed them with their hand after the fire died. I knelt down and touched the ashes. They were fine as powder, finer than any wood ash I'd ever seen. That's when I noticed the tracks. They started at the edge of the campsite and led toward the thick woods on the north side of the hollow. Human footprints. But something was wrong with them. I got down on my hands and knees to get a better look in the fading light. Bare feet, That was the first strange thing. Who walks around barefoot in October in the mountains? The second thing made my blood run cold. These weren't normal footprints. Each foot had 6 toes. I sat back on my heels, staring at those impossible tracks. In 18 years of rangering, I'd seen bear tracks, wildcat tracks, even the rare print of a mountain lion. But I'd never seen anything like this. The rational part of my mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was some kind of deformity. Maybe there were people living up in these mountains, hidden away from civilization. Lord knows it had happened before. During the Civil War, deserters from both armies had hidden in these hills. During Prohibition, whole families had lived off the grid to avoid the law. But 6 toes? On both feet? I pulled out my compass to get my bearings before full dark set in. The needle spun lazily in circles, unable to find magnetic north. I tapped the glass, but it didn't help. Great. That meant I'd have to navigate by landmarks and hope my sense of direction held up in the morning. I decided to make camp right there and start tracking at first light. I pitched my small tent between the 3 abandoned ones, trying not to think about what might have happened to their owners. I built a fire and heated up a can of beans, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked up from the flames, I thought I saw movement in the dark trees around the hollow. Just the edge of motion, gone as soon as I turned my head. Probably deer, I told myself. Wolf. Or maybe the hunters themselves, lost and trying to find their way back to camp. But deep down, I knew it wasn't deer. As the fire burned down to coals, I tried my radio one more time. Instead of Jim's voice or even static, I heard something that made my hands shake. Children laughing, faint and far away, but definitely children. Happy laughter, like kids playing some wonderful game. The problem was there weren't supposed to be any children within 20 miles of this place. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me sit up in my sleeping bag, listening. Around 3 in the morning, I heard singing. A woman's voice, high and sweet, carrying an old mountain ballad I recognized from my childhood. My grandmother used to sing the same song while she worked in her garden. But when I unzipped my tent and looked out, there was nobody there. Just the cold October air and the dark trees standing like sentinels around the hollow. At first light, I started following those 6-toed tracks. They led up the north slope through rhododendron thickets and over moss-covered rocks. The trail was clear at first, pressed deep into the soft earth near a creek. But the higher I climbed, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew thicker and darker, old-growth hemlock and pine that blocked out most of the morning light. The air felt heavy, like before a thunderstorm, even though the sky was clear. My watch stopped working around 8 o'clock, the hands frozen at 20 past the hour. I'd been climbing for about an hour when the mist started rolling in. That wasn't unusual in the Smokies. Morning fog was common in the valleys. But this mist was different. Instead of drifting random patterns like normal fog, it seemed to form shapes, straight lines and perfect circles that held their form for long moments before dissolving. The tracks led to an old logging road I'd never seen before. That puzzled me, because I thought I knew every road and trail in this part of the park. But there it was, overgrown with weeds and small trees, but still clearly a road. The 6-toed prints followed it up the mountain. After another half hour of hiking, I started hearing the children again, laughing and calling to each other, the sound echoing through the trees. I couldn't make out words, but their voices had a strange quality, like they were speaking some old-fashioned dialect. Then I smelled wood smoke. The road curved around a massive boulder, and suddenly I was standing at the edge of a settlement. A dozen log cabins arranged around a small clearing with vegetable gardens and split-rail fences. Chickens pecked in the dirt yards, and I could see wash hanging on lines between the houses. It looked like a scene from 100 years ago, but that wasn't possible. This was federal parkland. There weren't supposed to be any settlements up here. The government had bought out all the mountain families back in the 1930s when they created the park. I stood at the tree line trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The cabins were in perfect condition, as if they'd been built yesterday. Smoke curled from stone chimneys. Oil lamps glowed warm yellow in the windows, even though it was full daylight. And then I saw the children. 3 little ones playing with wooden hoops in the center of the settlement. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the girls in long dresses and bonnets, the boy in suspenders and knickers. They looked normal enough from a distance, just kids having fun. But something about the way they moved wasn't right. Too graceful. Too quick. And when one of them threw her hoop toward a chicken coop, it sailed through the air with impossible accuracy, spinning perfectly upright for at least 50 yards before settling gently around a fence post. No child could throw like that. I was so focused on watching the children that I almost missed the adults. A tall, thin woman emerged from one of the cabins wearing a dress that belonged in a museum. She was pale as milk and moved with the same strange grace as the children. Behind her came a man in a broad-brimmed hat and rough work clothes. They both turned to look directly at me. I was hidden in the trees, at least 100 yards away, but somehow they knew exactly where I stood. The woman raised her hand and waved, like she was greeting an old friend. "Come on down, stranger," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "We've been expecting you." Every instinct I had told me to turn around and run. But I was here to find 3 missing hunters, and this was the first sign of human life I'd encountered. Maybe these people had seen Bobby, Dale, and Carl. Maybe they could help. I stepped out of the trees and walked down into the settlement. Up close, the woman looked even stranger. She was probably in her 30s, but her hair was completely white, braided and pinned up under her bonnet. Her skin was so pale it was almost transparent, and her eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen. "Name's Sarah Whitlock," she said, extending her hand. "This here's my husband, Jeremiah." I shook her hand and immediately regretted it. Her skin was ice cold and her grip was strong enough to crack bones. "Mac Brennan," I managed. "I'm a park ranger. I'm looking for 3 men who went missing, hunters. Have you seen anyone come through here?" Sarah smiled, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "Oh yes, we've seen them. They're right here with us, having supper." She pointed toward the largest cabin at the end of the settlement. Through its windows I could see figures sitting around a table. "They've been here near 2 days now," Jeremiah said. His voice was deep and had the same old-fashioned accent as his wife's. "Good men. We've been taking real good care of them." Relief flooded through me. They were alive. Thank God. I need to speak with them. "Of course you do," Sarah said. "Come along." But as we walked toward the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The 3 children were following us, and now I could see their faces clearly. They looked normal enough. Rosy cheeks, bright eyes, missing teeth where baby teeth had fallen out. Except their eyes were the same pale, washed-out blue as the adults, and when they smiled at me, their teeth looked too sharp. Sarah opened the cabin door and gestured for me to go in. "Boys," she called out cheerfully, "you got a visitor." The interior of the cabin was warm and cozy, lit by oil lamps and heated by a stone fireplace. A long wooden table dominated the room, set with pewter plates and cups. And there, sitting at the table, were the 3 missing hunters. At least, I thought they were the hunters. Bobby, Dale, and Carl sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with glassy, unfocused eyes. They looked like they'd aged 20 years since their driver's license photos were taken. Their hair was streaked with gray, their faces lined with deep wrinkles. But the worst part was their expressions. They looked empty, like nobody was home behind their eyes. "Bobby?" I said, moving closer to the table. "Bobby Hutchins. I'm Mac Brennan, park ranger. Your wife sent me to find you." Bobby turned his head slowly toward me. When he spoke, his voice was flat and lifeless. "Wife? I don't remember a wife." Dale and Carl didn't react at all. They just kept staring at their plates, occasionally lifting forkfuls of some kind of stew to their mouths. "What's wrong with them?" I demanded, turning to face Sarah and Jeremiah. "Wrong?" Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Ain't nothing wrong. They just been here a good long while, that's all. Time moves different in the Hollow. They've been with us near 40 years now." 40 years? That's impossible. They've been missing for 2 days. 2 days out there, maybe, Jeremiah said, nodding toward the door. But they've been sitting at our table since the winter of '34. Good guests, too, Niverness, or complained about the cooking. The room started spinning around me. This couldn't be happening. People didn't age decades in 2 days. Settlements from the 1800s didn't exist in the middle of a national park. But I was looking right at it. I backed toward the door, but Sarah moved faster than any human should be able to move. Suddenly, she was between me and the exit, smiling her sharp-toothed smile. "Now where you going, Mac Brennan?" she asked sweetly. "You just got here. Why don't you sit and have some supper with us? We got plenty." I tried to push past Sarah, but she didn't budge. It was like trying to move a tree. Behind me, I heard Jeremiah's heavy footsteps crossing the cabin floor. "Don't be rude, stranger," he said. "Sarah's the finest cook in the hollow. You don't want to miss her rabbit stew." The three hunters continued eating mechanically, not looking up from their plates. Bobby's hands shook as he lifted his spoon, and I could see liver spots on his knuckles that definitely hadn't been there 2 days ago. "I have to go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "People are expecting me back." "Are they now?" Sarah tilted her head like a bird studying a worm. "Who's expecting you, Mac Brennan?" For a moment, my mind went blank. Who was expecting me? There was someone. Jim. Yes, Jim Parker. My supervisor. But when I tried to picture his face, it seemed fuzzy, like a photograph left too long in the sun. "My boss," I said. "Jim Parker. He'll send search teams if I don't check in." Sarah and Jeremiah looked at each other and laughed. Not a pleasant sound. "Time moves strange here in the hollow," Sarah said. "Always has. You could stay with us for 10 years, and when you leave, it'd only be tomorrow morning out there in your world." "That's impossible." "Is it?" Jeremiah asked. He walked to one of the windows and pushed back the curtain. "Look outside, Max. Brennan, tell me what you see." I looked. The settlement was still there, but something was different. The light was wrong, too golden, like late afternoon instead of morning. And the trees around the clearing looked different, smaller, younger. "The Cherokee knew about this place," Sarah continued. "Called it the hollow where time sleeps. They were smart enough to leave it alone. But when the white settlers came, some of them weren't so wise." "What are you?" I whispered. "We're the hollow folk," she said simply. "Been living here since 1838, the year of the Great Removal, when they drove the Cherokee west. Some of us were part of that march. Some of us were the ones doing the driving." She moved closer, and I caught a smell coming off her. Old flowers and deeper earth, like a grave that had been opened after many years. "We made some mistakes back then," she said. "Hurt some people who didn't deserve hurting. And the Cherokee medicine man, he was powerful angry about it. Put a curse on us before he died. Trapped us here, between one heartbeat and the next, between the tick and the tock of the clock." Jeremiah nodded grimly. "We can't die, and we can't truly live. Just exist here in this moment that never ends. Winter of 1838, coldest anyone could remember." I looked out the window again. Sure enough, there was snow beginning to fall, even though it had been a warm October day when I entered the hollow. "But the curse had a mercy in it," Sarah continued. "If people come to us willingly, choose to stay for supper, we can share our burden with them, take some of their years to ease our endless winter." "You're killing them," I said, gesturing toward the hunters. "Not killing," Jeremiah corrected. "Just borrowing. They got 60, 70 years ahead of them. We only take what we need to make it through another day." Bobby suddenly looked up from his plate. For just a moment, his eyes seemed to clear. "Mac?" he said in a voice that sounded more like himself. "Mac, get out of here. Run. Don't let them." Sarah reached over and touched his forehead gently. "Boo." Bobby's eyes went glassy again, and he returned to his mechanical eating. "Poor Bobby," Sarah said sadly. "He's been fighting us the longest. Still tries to remember sometimes. But the hollow always wins in the end." I had to get out of there. These people, these things, had already stolen decades from 3 innocent men. If I stayed much longer, I'd end up just like them. I fainted toward the door, then dove through the nearest window instead. The glass shattered around me as I crashed through, cutting my arms and face. I hit the ground hard and rolled, then scrambled to my feet and ran. Behind me I heard Sarah's voice, no longer sweet and friendly. "You can't leave the hollow, Mac Brennan. Once you're here for good." I ran through the settlement, past the other cabins. More hollow folk came out to watch me. Men, women, and children, all dressed in clothes from over a century ago. They didn't try to stop me, just watched with those pale, terrible eyes. At the edge of the clearing, I looked back at the logging road I'd followed into this place. It was gone. Where there had been a clear path just an hour ago, now there was only thick forest. No road, no trail, no way out. I picked a direction and started pushing through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I had to find a way out. I had to get back to the real world and warn people about this place. But every direction I went, I kept coming back to the settlement. No matter how far I walked or how carefully I navigated, I always ended up at the same clearing, looking at the same impossible cabins. The hollow folk waited for me each time, standing patiently at the edge of their settlement. They never chased me, never tried to drag me back. They just waited, with the patience of people who had all the time in the world. After my 4th attempt to leave, I was exhausted and bleeding from doze. Tons of cuts. Sarah approached me slowly, like someone trying not to spook a wild animal. "You're hurting yourself for nothing," she said. "The hollow don't want to let you go. You might as well accept it." "There has to be a way out," I panted. "Maybe there is," she admitted. "The Cherokee man who cursed us, he said something about blood calling to blood. Never did figure out what he meant." Cherokee blood. My grandmother's face flashed in my memory. She'd been part Cherokee, though she'd never talked about it much. In those days, it wasn't something people advertised. Too much prejudice, too much pain. But she'd taught me a few words in the Cherokee language when I was small, and she'd told me stories about the old days, before the white man came to the mountains. "What was the medicine man's name?" I asked. Sarah's pale eyes narrowed. "Why do you want to know?" "Maybe I can find a way to break your curse. Free all of us." She laughed bitterly. "You think we haven't tried? 136 years we've been trapped here. You think we haven't thought of everything?" But I could see doubt in her expression. Hope, maybe, buried deep under decades of despair. "His name was Sequoia," Jeremiah said quietly. "Not the famous one who made the writing. A different man. A powerful medicine man from the Kituwa towns. Sequoia. I remembered that name from my grandmother's stories. She'd said he could speak to the spirits, could see the future in fire and smoke. "Tell me exactly what he said when he cursed you." Sarah and Jeremiah exchanged a long look before Sarah finally spoke. "It was December of 1838, she began. Coldest winter anyone could remember. Most of the Cherokee had already been forced west on the trail they call the Trail of Tears, but some were hiding up in these mountains trying to avoid the soldiers. She led me back into the cabin where the 3 hunters still sat at their eternal meal. I tried not to look at them as she continued her story. Our settlement was different then. We were living people, trying to scratch out a life in these hills. Times were hard, and we were desperate. When we found the Cherokee camp in the next valley, we saw an opportunity." "You attacked them," I said. Jeremiah nodded heavily. "We told ourselves we were doing our patriotic duty. The government wanted all Cherokee gone, didn't matter if they were hiding or not. But really, we just wanted their supplies. Food, warm clothes, whatever they had that could help us get through the winter." "There were maybe 30 of them," Sarah continued. "Men, women, children. They weren't soldiers or warriors, just people trying to survive. We fell on them in the night like wolves." I could see the shame in her pale eyes, a guilt that had been eating at her for over a century. Sequoia was their medicine man, old and wise, with power in his voice. As he lay dying, he spoke words in the Cherokee tongue. I didn't understand all of them, but I knew it was a curse. "What exactly did he say?" Sarah closed her eyes, remembering. "He said we'd stolen their time. So we'd be trapped in time. Said we'd feel the cold of that winter forever, never knowing spring again. And then, she paused, struggling with the memory. Then what? He said the curse could only be broken by one who carried the blood of both peoples, Cherokee and white. Someone who could speak for both the dead and the living. My heart was pounding. My grandmother had been half Cherokee, which made me 1/8. It wasn't much, but maybe it was enough. He said something else too, Jeremiah added. Something about the sacred fire and the words of renewal. Sacred fire. I remembered that from grandmother's stories. The Cherokee kept a sacred fire burning in their towns, a flame that was never allowed to die. And the words of renewal. Those were the prayers they said at the green corn ceremony, when they asked the spirits to forgive past wrongs and allow the people to start fresh. Need you to gather everyone in the settlement, I said. Every single person. Why? Because I think I know how to break the curse, but it has to be done right, with everyone present. Sarah looked skeptical, but she nodded to Jeremiah. He left the cabin, and I heard him calling to the other hollow folk. Within minutes, they began gathering in the central clearing, maybe 40 people total, all dressed in their old-fashioned clothes. They looked at me with expressions ranging from hope to suspicion. Some of the children held their parents' hands, sensing that something important was about to happen. I need wood, I told them. Dry wood, enough for a good fire, and I need it arranged in a circle, the Cherokee way. They brought wood from their cabins and arranged it as I directed. As they worked, I tried to remember the Cherokee words my grandmother had taught me. It had been so many years, and I'd been just a boy when she spoke them. When the fire was built, I knelt beside it and pulled out my matches. Sequoia cursed you because you stole time from his people, I said. You took their lives, their future, their chance to see their children grow up. But he also gave you a way out, because he understood that hatred and vengeance only create more suffering. I struck a match and touched it to the kindling. The fire caught quickly, flames dancing up into the cold air. I am Mac Brennan, I said loudly so everyone could hear. My grandmother was Mary Groundhog, daughter of Joseph Groundhog of the Kituwa people. Through her I carry Cherokee blood. Through my grandfather, I carry the blood of the white settlers. I speak for both peoples, and I call on the spirits of both to witness what happens here. The fire was burning strongly now, sending sparks up toward the darkening sky. I took a deep breath and tried to remember the Cherokee words for renewal and forgiveness. Navi Uzdaiv, I said, hoping I was pronouncing it correctly. Galakwoti Ali Uzdaiv. Forgiveness and renewal. The wind suddenly picked up, making the flames dance wildly, some of the whole. Low folk stepped back nervously. Sequoia, medicine man of the Cherokee, you cursed these people for their crimes against your family. Your anger was just. Your grief was real. But the wheel of time should not stop turning. The seasons should not be trapped in endless winter. I threw more wood on the fire, making it blaze higher. I ask you to release them from their curse, not because they deserve it, but because keeping them trapped serves no purpose. The dead are dead. The living should be allowed to live or die in their proper time. The fire suddenly flared white hot, so bright I had to shield my eyes. When I looked up, I saw him. Sequoia stood on the other side of the fire, translucent but clearly visible. He was an old man with long gray hair and deep lines in his weathered face. His clothes were traditional Cherokee, deerskin shirt and leggings, with a feather in his hair. He looked at me with eyes full of ancient sorrow and spoke in Cherokee. I couldn't understand all his words, but I caught enough to get the meaning. He was asking if I truly spoke for both peoples. I do, I said. I speak for the Cherokee who were murdered here, and I speak for these white people who have been trapped by their own evil for over a century. Both sides have suffered enough. Sequoia nodded slowly. He raised his hands and spoke again, his voice carrying clearly over the crackling fire. This time he spoke in English, so everyone could understand. The curse is lifted, he said. Time will flow again, the seasons will turn, but remember this day, all of you. Remember the cost of hatred and the price of forgiveness. The fire suddenly died down to normal flames. Sequoia's image faded like morning mist. And then I felt it. A shift in the air, like a held breath being released. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on the hollow was lifting. Around me, the hollow folk were changing. Their pale skin was gaining color, their too sharp teeth becoming normal. The children laughed with genuine joy instead of that eerie, glass-breaking sound. But they were also aging rapidly. 136 years of stolen time was catching up with them all at once. Within moments, most of them had crumbled to dust, finally allowed to experience the death that had been denied them for so long. Only the youngest ones survived, the children and a few adults who had been babies when the curse was cast. They stood in the clearing, looking around in wonder at a world that was suddenly real again. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. She was one of the survivors, now looking like the young woman she truly was. "Thank you for setting us free." The settlement was dissolving around us like a dream. The cabins flickered and faded, returning to the ruins they'd been for over a century. The warm oil lamps winked out, replaced by cold moonlight. But the three hunters were changing too. The decades that had been stolen from them were flowing back, their gray hair darkening, their wrinkled faces becoming smooth again. Bobby Hutchins sat up straight and looked around with clear, confused eyes. Where are we? What happened?" "You're safe," I told him. "You're all safe now." The walk out of White Oak Sink took 6 hours. The trail that had led into the hollow was back, clear and well marked. Bobby, Dale, and Carl walked beside me in stunned silence, unable to remember most of what had happened to them during their time with the hollow folk. Maybe that was a mercy. The few surviving settlers came with us. Sarah and 3 children, the last remnants of a community that had been trapped between heartbeats for over a century. They would need help adjusting to the modern world, but they were free, truly free, for the first time since 1838. By the time we reached my truck, the sun was rising over the eastern ridges. I radioed Jim Parker to let him know the hunters had been found safe. "Jesus, Mac, where have you been?" Jim's voice crackled over the radio. We've had search teams out looking for you all night." "All night?" I looked at my watch. It was working again, showing 6:30 a.m. According to Jim, I'd been gone for less than 24 hours. But I felt like I'd aged years during my time in the hollow. When I looked in the truck's rearview mirror, I saw that I had aged. My hair was streaked with gray now, and there were new lines around my eyes. The curse was broken, but there had been a price for breaking it. The official report said the hunters had gotten lost and suffered from exposure and dehydration. The strange aging that we'd all experienced was attributed to trauma and stress. Nobody questioned it too closely. These mountains had a reputation for strange happenings. Sarah and the 3 children were taken in by a Cherokee family in North Carolina. The tribal council, when they heard the full story, said it was justice long delayed, but justice nonetheless. The spirits of Sequoia's people could finally rest. But I knew there were other hollows in these mountains, other places where time moved strangely, where the past refused to stay buried. Over the next few years, I made it my business to find them and document their locations. Most I was able to seal off with warning signs and creative trail routing. A few required more direct intervention. But that's another story for another day. I never forgot what Sarah told me during our last conversation before she left for her new life. The mountains remember everything, Mac Brennan, every kindness and every cruelty. The Cherokee knew that. That's why they treated the land with respect. Now, 40 years later, I'm finally getting ready to retire. My replacement is a young woman named Lisa Chen, smart and fearless like I used to be. I've been teaching her the old stories, showing her the places on the maps where I've written "Do Not Enter" in red ink. "Why these particular spots?" she asked me last week. "Because some places in these mountains exist outside normal time," I told her, "and some of the people who live there have been waiting a very long time for visitors." She looked at me like I might be getting too old for the job. Maybe I am, but I sleep better at night knowing that White Oak Sink is quiet now, that the hollow folk have found their peace at last. Still, sometimes when the mist rolls thick through the valleys, I remember that there are other hollows out there, other places where the past isn't quite past, where time moves like honey, slow and strange. And I remember Sequoia's final words, spoken in Cherokee, but clear in meaning. The wheel turns, but it always comes back to where it started. The mountains remember everything, every kindness, every cruelty, and they're always watching. My name is Maria Santos Rodriguez, and I've been a park ranger for 14 years. I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. I was wrong. It was October of 1979 when I got the call that would change my life forever. I was working at the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky in the Cultural Resources Department. My job was to study the old mountain communities and help protect their history. I loved it, talking to elderly folks about their families, learning about old crafts and customs that were disappearing. The phone rang on a Tuesday morning. Cold air was already creeping down from the mountains, and the Weather Service was talking about early snow. "Maria, this is Tom Henderson from the main office. We got a strange request from up on Newman's Ridge. Some family up there wants to talk to someone about what they're calling a family problem. They specifically asked for you." I frowned. Newman's Ridge was one of the most isolated places in my territory. The old logging roads were barely passable, and only a handful of families still lived up there. Most people called them Melungeons, mixed-race folks whose families had been in these mountains since before the Civil War. "What kind of family problem?" I asked. They wouldn't say over the phone, but Maria, they seemed really scared. The woman I talked to kept saying something about their children. She begged me to send someone who understood mountain people. I'd written papers about the Melungeon families for the state university. Their history fascinated me. Nobody knew exactly where they came from originally. Some said they were descendants of shipwrecked sailors. Others claimed they were escaped slaves mixed with Native Americans. The families themselves had stories about ancestors from across the ocean. But after centuries of keeping to themselves, the truth had gotten mixed up with legend. "I'll head up there tomorrow," I told Tom. The next morning, I loaded my truck with my usual gear, recording equipment, cameras, notebooks, and my genealogy research files. The October air was sharp and clean, smelling of dying leaves and wood smoke. Perfect weather for a drive into the mountains. The road to Newman's Ridge started out paved, then turned to gravel, then to rutted dirt. My truck bounced and groaned as I climbed higher. The trees grew thicker, blocking out more and more sunlight. I passed the last power line about 5 miles from the ridge. Finally, the road ended at a cluster of old houses scattered across the mountaintop. They were simple wooden structures, most built in the 1800s, but kept in good repair. Gardens were brown and harvested for winter. A few chickens pecked in the yards. A woman came out of the nearest house as I parked. She looked to be in her 50s, with olive skin and dark hair streaked with gray. Her eyes were an unusual shade of green. "You the ranger woman?" she called. "Yes, ma'am. Maria Santos Rodriguez. You're the one who called?" "I'm Helen Mullins." She looked nervous, wringing her hands. "Thank you for coming. We didn't know who else to ask." "What seems to be the problem, Mrs. Mullins?" She glanced around, then motioned me toward her house. "It's the children. All our children. Something's happening to them, and we don't know what to do." I followed her inside. The house was simple but clean, with handmade furniture and quilts on the walls. It felt like stepping back in time 50 years. "Coffee?" she asked. "That would be nice, thank you." As she poured, I noticed her hands shaking slightly. "Mrs. Mullins, you said something was happening to the children. Are they sick?" "Not sick exactly." She sat down across from me. "It started about 2 months ago. First with my granddaughter Sarah, she's 8. She started talking different." "Different how?" "Speaking words we don't know, old-sounding words. And she began knowing things." Helen's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Things she couldn't possibly know." I pulled out my notebook. "Can you give me an example?" Helen was quiet for a long moment. "Last week, Sarah drew a picture of a man in strange clothes. Said it was her great-great-grandfather from the old country. But Maria, we don't have any pictures of him." Nobody alive ever met him. Children have active imaginations. She described the exact layout of a house in Turkey, drew maps of streets in some city called Istanbul. Sarah's never been further than the county seat. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. And it's not just Sarah, Helen continued. It's happening to children in all the families up here. 7 kids total, all between 6 and 12 years old. They're all changing. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the other houses scattered across the ridge. We've been isolated up here for generations, Maria. We keep to ourselves, mind our own business. But something's stirring now. Something that's been sleeping in our blood for a very long time. I wrote furiously, trying to capture everything. As an anthropologist, I'd studied plenty of isolated communities. Sometimes genetic isolation could cause unusual conditions. But this sounded like something else entirely. Mrs. Mullins, I'd like to meet these children if that's okay. Maybe observe them, record some of their speech patterns. Whatever's happening, we can figure it out. Her green eyes met mine, and I saw real fear there. I hope so, she said. Because yesterday, little Sarah told me something that scared me more than anything else. What did she say? She said a woman with a Spanish name was coming to help us. A woman who would understand because she carries the same old blood we do. The coffee cup slipped from my fingers, shattering on the floor. Helen stared at the broken coffee cup, then looked back at me with those strange green eyes. Your grandmother's name was Elena Santa Maria, she said quietly. She came from Virginia originally, but her people were from further back, much further back. My hands were shaking now. How could you possibly know that? I don't know it. Sarah knows it. And Sarah knows a lot more than any 8-year-old should. I'd never told anyone in Kentucky about my grandmother. Elena had died when I was 12, but she'd filled my childhood with stories about old countries across the ocean, about ancestors who'd traveled great distances to reach America. I'd always assumed they were just fairy tales. I think you better let me meet Sarah, I said. Helen led me across the ridge to another house, this one surrounded by a neat vegetable garden and a few fruit trees. An older man sat on the front porch, whittling. That's my husband, Joe, Helen explained. Sarah's in the backyard with her mother. We walked around the house and I saw a young woman hanging laundry on a line. Near her, a small girl with dark curly hair sat on the ground, drawing in the dirt with a stick. Linda, this is the ranger I told you about, Helen called. The young woman looked up. She had the same olive complexion and green eyes as Helen. Thank you for coming, she said. I'm Linda Mullins. This is Sarah. The little girl looked up from her dirt drawing and smiled. Hello, Miss Maria. I've been waiting for you. The casual way she said it made my skin crawl. Sarah, can you show Miss Maria what you've been drawing? I knelt down beside the child. In the dirt, she'd scratched out what looked like a map. Coastlines, islands, and cities marked with symbols I didn't recognize. It's the old country, Sarah said matter-of-factly, where our people came from before they got on the ships. Which old country, honey? The Ottoman place, where the Sultan lived in the big palace. She pointed to one of the symbols. This is where Grandfather Mehmet lived before he had to leave. I looked at Linda. Has she been reading history books? Sarah can't read yet, Linda said. We don't have any books about other countries anyway. Sarah suddenly looked up at me with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. Your grandfather spoke Arabic sometimes, didn't he? When he was working in his garden? I sat back hard. My grandfather Miguel had indeed spoken Arabic, something he'd learned from his own father. But I'd never told anyone that. Most people didn't even know he'd been my grandfather, since I'd taken my mother's name. How do you know that, Sarah? The old ones tell me things. They're always talking now. Which old ones? Sarah went back to her drawing. The first ones who came to these mountains. They had to hide because people were hunting them, but they brought their secrets with them. She looked up at me again, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw something ancient looking out through her young eyes. They brought their magic too. That evening, Helen arranged for me to meet with all the families on the ridge. We gathered in the Mullins living room, about 15 adults and 7 children. The children sat together on the floor, eerily quiet and well-behaved. I set up my tape recorder and started asking questions. What I heard in the next 2 hours changed everything I thought I knew about history, genetics, and reality itself. The children spoke in languages that shouldn't exist. Not just individual words, but full conversations in what sounded like archaic Turkish, Portuguese, and Arabic. Sometimes they mixed in Cherokee words, creating sentences that somehow made perfect sense to them but sounded like gibberish to everyone else. 9-year-old Tommy Sizemore drew detailed maps of Mediterranean coastlines and described the layout of 16th century ships. 6-year-old Beth Collins recited what sounded like prayers in Ottoman Turkish, complete with the correct pronunciation and rhythm. But it was 12-year-old David Mullins, Helen's grandson, who really shook me. "Miss Maria," he said during a quiet moment, "why did your family stop making the special marks?" "What special marks?" He pulled out a piece of paper and quickly sketched a symbol, an intricate design that combined Islamic crescents, Christian crosses, and other elements I didn't recognize. My blood turned to ice. It was identical to a pendant my grandmother had worn, something she'd said was a family protection charm from the old country. I'd never seen it anywhere else. "David, where did you see this symbol?" "Great-great-grandmother Fatima used to carve it into trees around our land, for protection from the bad spirits." "David," his mother said gently, "Fatima died before you were born." "Before I was born." "I know," he said simply, "but she still talks to me." The tape recorder suddenly squealed with feedback, even though I wasn't near it. The children all looked toward the door at the same time. "Someone's coming," Sarah whispered. We all listened. I heard nothing but mountain wind and settling wood. "No one's coming, honey," Helen said. "Yes," Sarah insisted. 3 men in a big truck. They have badges and guns. They want to take us away to study us." My radio crackled to life. Something that shouldn't have been possible this far from any tower. "Maria, this is Tom at headquarters. You need to get out of there now. Federal agents are heading your way. Something about reports of unusual activity. They have orders to bring in anyone showing supernatural abilities for testing." The radio went dead. Helen grabbed my arm. How could Sarah have known? But Sarah was already standing along with all the other children. Their eyes were wide and focused on something I couldn't see. "We have to go to the old place," David said. "The ancestors are calling." "What old place?" I asked. "The first settlement," Sarah said, "where they buried the real secrets." Outside, I could hear truck engines in the distance, growing louder. The sound of engines was getting closer. Helen quickly started blowing out the oil lamps while the other adults moved with surprising efficiency, like they'd practiced this before. "Everyone knows what to do," Joe Mullins said quietly. "Take the old trail to the upper ridge." "What's happening?" I whispered to Helen as she stuffed some supplies into a canvas bag. "Every few generations, outsiders come asking questions about our children. Usually we can hide it, wait for things to calm down. But this time is different." Sarah appeared at my elbow, tugging on my jacket. "Miss Maria, you have to come with us. The ancestors say you're needed." "Sarah, I don't understand any of this. Your blood remembers, even if your mind forgot." She took my hand, and I felt a strange warmth spread up my arm. "Come on." The children were already moving toward the back door with an urgency that seemed unnatural for kids their age. The adults followed, and I found myself swept along with them. We slipped out the back and into the forest. The children moved through the darkness like they could see perfectly, leading us along a narrow trail that wound up the mountain. I stumbled over roots and rocks, but somehow the kids never missed a step. Behind us, I heard vehicles pulling up to the houses, doors slamming, voices shouting orders. "How much further?" Linda whispered to her daughter. "Not far," Sarah replied. "Great-grandfather Ibrahim is showing me the way." We climbed for maybe 20 minutes. The trail got steeper and rockier until I wasn't sure it was a trail at all anymore. But the children never hesitated. Finally, we reached a small clearing near the top of the ridge. In the moonlight, I could make out the ruins of very old stone foundations, much older than any of the houses below. "This is where they first settled," Helen said, breathing hard from the climb. "The original families, back in the 1600s. "I thought the Melungeon settlements weren't that old," I said. "Most people think that," Joe replied. "But our people have been in these mountains a lot longer than anyone realizes." The children were already spreading out through the ruins, touching stones and whispering in those strange languages. It was like they were having conversations with invisible people. Tommy Sizemore suddenly stopped and pointed to a flat stone near the center of the clearing. "We need to move that one." "Tommy, that stone weighs more than all of us put together," his father said. "Not if we all help," David said. "Not if we do it the old way." The 7 children joined hands around the stone and began chanting in unison. The words weren't in any language I recognized, but they sent shivers down my spine. The sound seemed to make the air itself vibrate. The massive stone began to glow with a faint blue light. "This isn't possible," I whispered. "Many things are possible," Sarah said without looking away from the stone, "when you remember who you really are." The stone slowly began to rise, floating a few inches above the ground. Underneath, I could see a dark opening leading down into the mountain. "The hiding place," David said, "where they kept the most important things." Helen looked at me with frightened eyes. "Maria, I think you should go down first. The children say you'll understand what we find down there." "I'm just a park ranger. I don't understand any of this." "You're more than that," Sarah said, finally looking at me. "Your family." Before I could protest, she handed me a flashlight and gently pushed me toward the opening. The stone steps leading down were worn smooth by centuries of use. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing me to duck as I descended. The walls were covered with carved symbols, the same design David had shown me earlier, along with others that looked like a mixture of Islamic, Christian, and Cherokee markings. The tunnel opened into a small underground chamber. My flashlight beam revealed wooden chests, clay pottery, and bundles wrapped in oiled leather. Everything was perfectly preserved in the dry mountain air. I opened one of the leather bundles and found manuscripts written in multiple languages: Arabic, Turkish, Portuguese, and what might have been Cherokee syllabary, all mixed together on the same pages. Another bundle contained maps, not of America, but of Mediterranean coastlines, North African ports, and Ottoman territories. These weren't copies. They were original charts, drawn by hand centuries ago. But it was the third bundle that made me sit down hard on the stone floor. It contained a genealogy chart that traced families from Ottoman Turkey to Portuguese colonies to Cherokee territories to the mountains of Kentucky. And there, written in faded ink, was my own family name, Santa Maria. According to the chart, my grandmother Elena had been the daughter of a Melungeon woman who'd left the ridge in the 1920s, which meant I carried the same mixed bloodline as everyone else up here, which meant whatever was happening to these children could happen to me too. I climbed back up the tunnel to find the adults and children sitting in a circle, waiting for me. "You found it," Helen said. It wasn't a question. "Found what?" "The proof. The real history of our people." Sarah stood up and walked over to me. "Now you understand why the ancestors called you here. You're one of us, Miss Maria. You always were." "But why now? Why are the children suddenly developing these abilities?" David answered. "Because danger is coming. Not just the men with badges. Something much worse. The ancestors are waking up our gifts because we're going to need them." "What kind of danger?" Before anyone could answer, the floating stone suddenly crashed back down over the tunnel entrance with a sound like thunder. The children all turned toward the forest at the same time. "They found us," Tommy whispered. Through the trees I could see flashlight beams moving up the trail. The federal agents had tracked us to the old settlement, but as the lights got closer I realized something was wrong. The beams were moving too fast, too erratically. And underneath the sound of footsteps, I could hear something else, a low growling that didn't sound human. "That's not the government men," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "Then what is it?" I asked. David's face had gone pale. "The Shadow Walkers, the ancestors' old enemies. They've been sleeping in the deep places, but something woke them up." The growling was getting closer, and now I could see that the lights weren't flashlights at all. They were glowing eyes, moving through the darkness. Helen grabbed my arm. "Maria, the children say you have power in your blood, but it's still sleeping. We need to wake it up, right now." "I don't know how—" "Yes, you do," Sarah said urgently. "Close your eyes and listen. Your grandmother is trying to tell you something." I closed my eyes, and suddenly I could hear Elena's voice as clearly as if she were standing next to me. "Mija, remember the old words. Remember the protection songs." And incredibly, I did remember. Words in Arabic and Spanish that Elena had taught me as lullabies, songs I'd thought were just nonsense rhymes. But now I understood. They were spells, protective charms passed down through generations. I opened my mouth and began to sing. The moment I started singing, everything changed. The air around us began to shimmer with the same blue light we'd seen around the stone. The children joined in, their voices harmonizing with mine in languages they'd never learned, but somehow knew perfectly. The glowing eyes in the forest stopped moving toward us. "Keep singing," Helen whispered urgently. "It's working." But as our voices rose, the growling got louder. Whatever these shadow walkers were, they didn't like our protective songs. The sound became a roar of rage that echoed through the mountains. Sarah suddenly grabbed my hand. "Miss Maria, they're not just angry, they're afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of us. Of what we can become if we all work together." Through our joined hands, I felt something flowing between us, warm, electric, ancient. And suddenly I could see what she was seeing. The Shadow Walkers weren't just monsters. They were the spirits of people who'd been consumed by hatred and fear generations ago. Settlers who'd tried to drive the Melungeon families from these mountains. Government agents who'd experimented on gifted children. Anyone who'd used violence against people they didn't understand. Over the centuries, that hatred had twisted them into something no longer human. They fed on fear and persecution, growing stronger every time someone was hurt for being different. "They've been sleeping in the caves under the mountain," David said, his young voice strange and deep. "But when the government men started coming tonight, it woke them up. They think it's time to hunt again." The roaring was getting closer. I could see shapes moving between the trees now, tall, dark figures that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "How do we stop them?" I asked. "We don't stop them," Sarah said. "We heal them." "Heal them?" "The ancestors say that's why our gifts are awakening now. Not to fight, but to heal the old wounds that created these monsters." Little Beth Collins, who'd been silent through all of this, suddenly spoke up. "Miss Maria, your grandmother, Elena, tried to do this once before, but she was alone. She couldn't finish it." "How do you know that?" "She's here with us now. She says she's been waiting for you to come home." I looked around the circle of faces, adults and children who'd become my family in the space of a few hours. People who carried the same mixed heritage of cultures and traditions that had been forced to hide in these mountains for centuries. "What do I need to do?" Sarah squeezed my hand tighter. "Trust us, and trust the old knowledge in your blood." The Shadow Wa. Elkers burst into the clearing. There were dozens of them, tall, dark shapes with burning red eyes and hands that ended in claws. They surrounded our circle, snarling and reaching toward us with fingers that seemed to trail darkness. But the moment they touched the edge of our blue light, they screamed and pulled back. "Now," David said. "Everyone together." We all joined hands. The 7 gifted children, their parents, grandparents, and me. I felt power flowing through the circle, connecting us to something vast and ancient. And suddenly, I could see the Shadow Walkers as they really were. They had once been people, frightened, angry people who'd lashed out at anything different from themselves. but centuries of hatred had eaten away their humanity, leaving only rage and hunger. "We see you," Sarah said, speaking not just to the monsters, but to the broken spirits trapped inside them. "We see your pain." The Shadow Walkers stopped snarling. For the first time, they looked confused. "You were hurt too," I found myself saying, the words coming from some deep place I didn't know existed. "Someone taught you to hate because they were afraid. Someone made you believe that different meant dangerous." One of the Shadow Walkers, the largest one, stepped closer to our circle. Its red eyes were still burning, but they looked almost curious now. "We forgive you," the children said in unison. "We forgive the fear that made you this way." The blue light around our circle began to expand, reaching out toward the Shadow Walkers. Where it touched them, their dark forms began to change. I saw flashes of who they'd been: a colonial settler terrified of losing his land, a government official ordered to study abnormal children, a local sheriff who'd been taught that mixed-race families were dangerous. All of them had started as people who'd been afraid, and fear, left to fester for generations, had turned them into monsters. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," I whispered. The largest Shadow Walker reached out and touched the edge of our light circle. Instead of pulling back, it stepped forward. As the blue light surrounded it, the dark shape began to dissolve. But instead of disappearing, it transformed into something else: the translucent figure of a middle-aged man in colonial-era clothes. His face was sad, but no longer twisted with hatred. "I'm sorry," he said in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "I was so afraid of losing everything. I forgot how to see you as people." One by one, the other Shadow Walkers stepped into our circle of light. Each one transformed back into the human spirit they'd once been. Each one asked for forgiveness, and each one faded peacefully away as the old hatred finally left them. When the last Shadow Walker had been healed and released, we sat in silence on the mountain ridge. The blue light gradually faded, but I could still feel the connection between all of us, a bond that went deeper than blood, deeper than race or culture. "Is it over?" Linda asked. "This part is," Helen said. "But there will be others. There are always people who fear what they don't understand." Sarah looked at me with those two old eyes. "That's why you have to stay, Miss Maria, to help us teach the next generation, to make sure the old knowledge doesn't get lost again." Down in the valley, I could see the government vehicles driving away. Apparently, with the Shadow Walkers gone, there was nothing supernatural left for them to investigate. "I have a job," I said weakly. "A life in town." "Your real job is here," David said simply. "Teaching people that different doesn't mean dangerous. Helping heal the fear that makes monsters." I looked around at the faces of my newfound family. People who carried the same mixed heritage that I'd spent my life trying to understand. People who'd found a way to preserve their culture and traditions even while hiding in the mountains. People who'd just shown me that the greatest magic of all was the ability to transform hatred into healing. "I'll need to give my notice," I said. Sarah smiled, the first truly childlike expression I'd seen from her. "Great-grandmother Elena says she's proud of you." "She's really here?" "She never left. None of the ancestors ever really leave. They just wait for us to remember how to listen." That was 46 years ago. I've been living on Newman's Ridge ever since. I did give my notice to the Forest Service, though I told them it was for health reasons rather than because I'd discovered I was descended from a supernatural mountain community. Some truths are too big for government paperwork. The ridge became my world. I helped the children learn to control their gifts while also making sure they got regular educations. We set up a one-room school in the old Mullins house, and I taught math and reading alongside Cherokee language preservation and Turkish genealogy. The federal agents never came back. According to the official reports, their investigation found no evidence of unusual activity in the area. The ridge was eventually designated as a protected cultural site, which gave us legal reasons to limit outside access. Sarah grew up to become a teacher herself. She married Tommy Sizemore and had 4 children, 2 of whom showed the same ancestral gifts. David became a lawyer who specialized in Native American rights cases, using his supernatural knowledge of family histories to help other communities prove their heritage claims. The other gifted children scattered across the country as adults, but they stayed in touch. They all found careers that let them help preserve threatened cultures and traditions: museum curators, anthropologists, cultural preservationists, teachers. And whenever one of their own children began showing signs of ancestral memory, they'd bring them back to the ridge for training. I'm 85 now. My own gifts grew stronger over the years, and I can speak fluently in languages I never formally learned: Arabic, Turkish, Portuguese, Cherokee, and at least 3 others that might not exist anywhere else in the world. Sometimes government researchers still show up asking questions about Melungeon heritage. I give them coffee and tell them about traditional crafts and family genealogies. I never mention the supernatural aspects. Some knowledge needs to stay protected. But I do teach at the State University now as an adjunct professor in the anthropology department. My courses on cultural preservation and minority heritage are very popular. Students come from all over the world to study with me. Most of them just want to learn about history and traditions. But occasionally I'll get a student who carries that same look in their eyes that Sarah had. The look of someone whose blood remembers things their mind hasn't learned yet. Those are the students I pay special attention to. The ones I invite for coffee and long conversations about their family histories. The ones I sometimes take on field trips to visit isolated mountain communities. Because the world is changing fast and old cultures are disappearing. But sometimes, in the right bloodlines, under the right circumstances, the ancestors wake up to make sure their knowledge survives. Yesterday, a young graduate student named Maria Gonzalez Kim came to my office. She's studying mixed heritage communities for her dissertation, and she wanted to interview me about Melungeon history. But when she shook my hand, I felt that familiar warmth, and I noticed she was wearing a pendant around her neck, an intricate symbol combining Korean characters, Spanish crosses, and Islamic crescents. "That's an interesting necklace," I said. "It was my grandmother's. She said it was for protection, but she never told me what it meant." "Would you like to come up to the ridge this weekend? I could show you some traditional crafts, and there are some children there who might find your research interesting." But she smiled, and for just a moment I saw something ancient and knowing in her eyes. "I'd love that, Professor Santos Rodriguez. I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to visit those mountains." Some bloodlines carry more than just genes. They carry destiny, and the mountain spirits are still calling their children home. The ridge is waiting for Maria Gonzalez Kim, just like it waited for me all those years ago. Just like it's waiting for others whose ancestors whisper in languages they don't remember learning, whose dreams are filled with places they've never been, whose blood carries the memory of magic. Because some things are too important to forget, even when the world tells you they're impossible. And sometimes, when the darkness gathers and fear tries to turn people into monsters again, the old knowledge wakes up to remind us that healing is always stronger than hatred. The mountain remembers everything, and it's still teaching those who know how to listen. My name is William Patterson, but folks call me Will. I've been a forest ranger for 19 years now, and before that I spent 7 years with the ATF. That's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. People ask me why I left federal work to walk around the woods all day, and I tell them the mountains are honest. They don't lie to you like people do. It was August of 1976 when everything went sideways. I was working the deep hollows of Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, where the mountains fold in on themselves like a crumpled paper bag. This wasn't tourist country. This was the kind of place where families had been making moonshine since before there were laws against it, where federal agents went missing and nobody asked too many questions. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. 2 ATF agents had been sent to investigate reports of a large-scale moonshine operation hidden somewhere in Whiskey Cove, a place so remote you needed a map just to find the trail that might take you to the trail that led there. The agents, Thompson and Martinez, had been due to check in the night before. Radio silence. My supervisor, Jim Crawford, handed me the assignment with a grim look. Will, I know you understand these mountain folk better than most. Your ATF background might help, but don't go playing federal agent. Just find our boys and get them home. I packed light, water, first aid kit, my service radio, and my grandfather's old hunting knife. Growing up in these mountains teaches you that sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones. My grandfather used to tell stories about Whiskey Cove, about families who'd been making shine there since his grandfather's time. He also told stranger stories, but I figured those were just mountain tales meant to keep kids away from the stills. The trail to Whiskey Cove wound through thick pine and oak, climbing steadily into air that tasted of moss and old rain. It took me 3 hours of hard walking to reach the first ridge, where you could look down into the hidden valley. From up there, the cove looked peaceful, a green bowl surrounded by granite walls with a clear stream running through it. But something felt wrong from the start. The forest was too quiet. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter, nothing. Even the insects had gone silent. In 19 years of walking these woods, I'd learned to trust that feeling when nature holds its breath. I followed the old deer path down into the cove, moving careful and quiet like my grandfather taught me. The stream gurgled along beside me, clear and cold, the kind of water that makes perfect moonshine. That's why the families chose this place. Good water, hidden location, and enough timber to fuel a dozen stills. I smelled it before I saw it. The sweet, yeasty scent of fermenting mash mixed with something else, something that reminded me of sulfur, like matches just struck. The smell got stronger as I followed the stream deeper into the cove. Then I found the still. It was a beautiful setup, I'll give them that. Copper pot gleaming in the afternoon sun, coils arranged perfect, the whole operation tucked under a natural rock overhang that would hide the smoke. But here's what made my skin crawl. The still was running by itself. No fire under the pot, but I could hear the mash bubbling away. No one tending it, but clear moonshine was dripping steady into glass jars. The equipment was warm to the touch, like it had been working all day, but there wasn't a soul in sight. I called out, "Hello? Forest Service!" My voice echoed off the rock walls and died. No answer. That's when I found the first piece of Thompson and Martinez's gear. Thompson's radio, or what was left of it. The metal had melted into a twisted shape that hurt to look at, like it had been in a fire hot enough to melt copper. But there was no fire damage around it, no scorch marks, nothing. I picked up the remains with a stick, not wanting to touch it with my bare hands. The smell of sulfur got stronger. That's when I heard the laughter. Not human laughter, something else. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the rocks like it was coming from inside the mountain itself. Low and mean, like someone had just heard the best joke in the world, and the joke was on me. I backed away from the still, hand moving to my radio. But when I tried to call it in, all I got was static mixed with that same laughter, fainter, but definitely there. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the cove. In those shadows, things seemed to move that shouldn't have been moving. I made the smart choice and got out of there, but all the way back up the trail, I could feel eyes watching me. That night I called my grandfather. "Granddad, you remember those stories about Whiskey Cove? The ones about the devil making moonshine?" Long pause on the other end. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "Billy, what did you see up there?" I told him everything. The silent forest, the self-running still, the melted radio, the laughter. Another pause. "Billy, you listen to me. Some stories ain't stories. Some things been in these mountains longer than people, and they don't much care for government men poking around. You be careful up there." "Granddad, 2 federal agents are missing." "I know, son. And I'm afraid they ain't missing any more. They just ain't on our side no more." I went back the next morning with backup. 2 other rangers, Mike Torres and Sarah Chen. Mike had been working the mountains for 10 years, and Sarah was fresh out of training, but smart as a whip. I figured 3 of us together could handle whatever was hiding in that cove. I was wrong. We took the same trail, but this time the forest felt different. Not quiet like before. Angry. The trees seemed to lean in toward the path, branches catching at our clothes. Sarah narrowed her eyes. Noticed it too. Is it just me? Or does it feel like the woods don't want us here? She whispered. Mike just grunted, but I saw him checking his radio more often than necessary. When we reached the ridge overlooking the cove, we stopped to glass the area with binoculars. The still was still there, still running. But now there were figures moving around it. I count 3 people, Mike said, adjusting his focus. 2 in dark clothes by the still, 1 more up the slope. I took a look. The figures were too far away to make out details, but something about the way they moved bothered me. Too smooth, too purposeful, like they were gliding instead of walking. Let's get down there, I said. The descent took 20 minutes, and by the time we reached the valley floor, the figures were gone. But the still was running harder than ever. The mash was bubbling like a pot of water on full boil, and the smell of sulfur was strong enough to make our eyes water. Jesus, Sarah said, covering her nose with her shirt. What kind of mash smells like that? I was examining the setup more closely when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The jars catching the moonshine weren't just collecting clear liquid. The stuff coming out of the coils was moving, swirling inside the glass like it was alive. Mike, Sarah, come look at this. They joined me by the collection point. The moonshine in the jars was definitely moving, forming patterns that almost looked like faces. Twisted faces, screaming silently in the clear liquid. That's not possible, Sarah said, but her voice was shaking. That's when we heard the voice. Well, well, more government boys come to call. We spun around. Standing by the still was a man in an old-fashioned black suit, the kind they wore in the 1920s. He was tall and thin, with a sharp face and eyes that reflected light like a cat's. His smile showed teeth, too white and too sharp. I'm Ranger Patterson, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. These are Rangers Torres and Chen. We're looking for 2 missing federal agents. The man's smile got wider. Oh, Thompson and Martinez? They're not missing. They're right here with me. They decided to take new employment. He gestured toward the slope behind him. 2 figures emerged from behind a boulder. They wore the dark clothes we'd seen from the ridge, but as they got closer, I could see they were Thompson and Martinez. At least they had been. Their skin had a gray, waxy look, and their eyes reflected light, just like the man in the suit. They moved with that same unnatural smoothness, and when Martinez opened his mouth to speak, his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Will Patterson, he said, though I'd never met him before today. We've been waiting for you. Thompson? Martinez? Mike called out. Are you boys all right? Thompson turned toward him, and I saw that half his face was burned away, showing white bone underneath. But he was still walking, still talking. We're better than all right, Thompson said in that same hollow voice. We've got the best job in the world. Perfect arrest record, perfect conviction rate. All we had to do was sign a little contract. The man in the suit laughed, that same sound I'd heard echoing through my radio. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm the proprietor of this establishment. Been making the finest moonshine in these mountains for, about 150 years now. Sarah had her hand on her radio. I'm calling this in. Go ahead, dear, the man said. Though I should warn you, federal communications don't work so well in my territory. She tried her radio. Nothing but static and that terrible laughter. Now then, the man continued, I imagine you're wondering about my operation here. It's really quite simple. I provide a service to the families in these mountains, the finest moonshine ever distilled. All they have to do is pay my price. What price? I asked. His smile showed more of those sharp teeth. Oh, nothing too steep, just their souls, and their children's souls, and their children's children's souls. I'm very patient about collecting, you see, compound interest. Mike was backing toward the trail, pulling his sidearm. Will, we need to get out of here. Now. I wouldn't, the man said. My employees, Thompson and Martinez, have orders to prevent anyone from leaving without signing a contract. The 2 dead agents stepped forward, blocking our exit. Up close, I could see that Thompson's burned face was still smoking slightly, and Martinez's hands ended in claws instead of fingers. You see, the man explained, federal agents make excellent employees. They're already used to bending the law to serve a higher power. The transition is quite easy. What do you want from us? Sarah asked. Same thing I wanted from them. A little cooperation. I've been having trouble with some of the local families lately. They want to break their contracts, go back to making inferior moonshine on their own. I need law enforcement officers to discourage such thinking. He walked over to the still and dipped a finger in the bubbling mash. When he pulled it out, the finger was steaming. This particular batch is special, made with the essence of Thompson and Martinez here. Gives it quite a kick. The moving shapes in the jars suddenly made horrible sense. Those weren't just patterns in the moonshine. They were Thompson and Martinez, trapped in liquid form, screaming forever. The deal is simple, the man said. Sign my contract and you'll have the most successful law enforcement career imaginable. Every case solved, every arrest clean, every conviction guaranteed. All I ask in return is your help keeping the local families in line. And if we refuse? I asked. His smile disappeared. Then you join Thompson and Martinez in my next batch. The temperature in the cove dropped 20 degrees. Frost began forming on the still's copper coils, and our breath came out in visible puffs. The two dead agents moved closer, and I could see their eyes, beginning to glow with a sickly yellow light. You have 5 minutes to decide, the man said, pulling an old pocket watch from his vest. Tick-tock. We ran. There wasn't any discussing it or planning it out. When that thing in the suit turned around to adjust something on his still, all three of us bolted for the trail at the same time. Behind us, we could hear Thompson and Martinez giving chase, but their movements were still too smooth, too gliding. They couldn't match 3 living people running scared through familiar terrain. We made it to the first ridge before Mike stumbled. He went down hard, rolled, and came up with his ankle twisted wrong. Go on, he gasped. Don't wait for me. Like hell, Sarah said, getting under his arm to support him. That's when we heard them coming. Not footsteps. Something worse. The sound of branches breaking, but breaking in patterns, like something was deliberately clearing a path. And underneath that, singing. Martinez's voice echoing through the trees. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. But the melody was wrong, twisted into something that made your teeth ache. We got Mike up the trail another 100 yards before we had to stop. His ankle was swelling fast and he was dead weight. Sarah was breathing hard and I knew we couldn't outrun them carrying Mike. There, I pointed to a cluster of boulders off the main trail. We can make a stand. We dragged Mike into the rocks just as Thompson appeared on the trail below us. In daylight, away from the still, he looked even worse. The burned half of his face had spread, and I could see his skull gleaming white through the char. He moved like a puppet with half its strings cut. Will Patterson, he called out. This is foolish. You can't escape the proprietor's territory. These mountains belong to him now. Since when? I shouted back, checking my pistol. Standard .38 service. Weapon, 6 rounds. Not much against something that was already dead. Since my great-great-grandfather signed the first contract in 1823, Thompson answered. Every lawman who's worked these mountains for the past 100 years has belonged to him. ATF, Revenue Service, even some of the state police. How did you think we always knew where the stills were? That hit me like a punch to the gut. My grandfather's stories came flooding back. How the federal agents always seemed to know exactly where to look. How some families got raided while others, deeper in the mountains, never got touched. How my own grandfather had warned me away from certain hollows when I was young. That's not possible, Sarah said, but she didn't sound convinced. Martinez appeared beside Thompson, moving through the underbrush without disturbing a single leaf. His claws caught the light, and when he smiled, I saw his teeth had been filed to points. Oh, it's very possible, he said. The proprietor has been building his network for generations. Local families provide the souls. Federal agents provide the protection. Everyone wins. Except the families, I said. The families get the best moonshine ever made, Thompson replied. Liquid that can cure any illness, grant any wish, solve any problem. All it costs is their immortal souls. Most of them think it's a bargain. Mike was trying to reload his weapon with shaking hands. He'd already fired 3 shots at the things below us, and they'd done nothing but put holes in dead meat. There's got to be a way to stop this, Sarah whispered. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me. Mountain spirits, he'd said, are bound by their own rules. They can't break a deal once it's made, but they also can't force you into one you haven't agreed to. The contracts, I said. There have to be actual contracts. Thompson tilted his head like a curious dog. Smart boy. Yes, there are contracts. Bound in federal law, signed in blood, filed with the county clerk's office. All legal and binding. But what if the contracts are invalid? I asked. Both dead agents went very still. Martinez's claws stopped clicking against the rocks. Invalid how? Thompson asked, and for the first time his hollow voice carried a note of uncertainty. Fraud, I said, my mind racing. Misrepresentation, signing under duress. Federal law has lots of ways to invalidate contracts. A new voice echoed through the forest, coming from everywhere at once. The proprietor, speaking from his still a quarter-mile away, but somehow right in our ears. Clever, Mr. Patterson, but you forget. I've had federal lawyers working for me for decades. Every contract is ironclad. Maybe, I said. But have you had them reviewed by someone who specializes in contract law? Someone who knows every federal regulation about alcohol taxation and enforcement? The forest went completely silent. Not even the wind stirred the leaves. What are you thinking, Will? Sarah whispered. I'm thinking I spent 7 years with the ATF, and I know every federal law about alcohol production and taxation in these mountains. If this thing has been using federal agents to protect illegal moonshine operations, there might be regulatory violations that could void the contracts. Thompson and Martinez started moving again, but faster now, more urgently. They were scrambling up the rocks toward us, their dead faces twisted with something like fear. The proprietor says talking time is over, Martinez hissed. I stood up, holding my grandfather's hunting knife. It was old steel, forged by hand in these mountains over a century ago. Tell your boss I want to see the contracts, I called out. All of them. If he's operating under federal authority, I have the right to inspect his documentation. The dead agents froze halfway up the rocks. You're not a federal agent anymore, Thompson said. No, but I'm still a sworn law enforcement officer in these mountains, and if your boss is claiming federal authority for his operations, he has to follow federal procedures. A sound rolled through the forest like thunder, but it wasn't thunder. It was laughter, huge and terrible, shaking leaves from the trees. Very well, Mr. Patterson, the proprietor's voice boomed. Let's discuss contracts, face to face. The air around us began to shimmer like heat waves, and suddenly we weren't on the ridge anymore. We were standing in the cove, right next to the still. Mike's twisted ankle was fine, and all our weapons were gone. The proprietor stood waiting for us, no longer bothering to look human. His suit was still there, but underneath it, his body was wrong. Too tall, joints bending the wrong way, fingers that were too long and ended in points. His face was sharp and cruel, and his eyes were pits of yellow fire. Welcome to my courtroom, Mr. Patterson, he said, gesturing to the rocks around us. They had changed too, shaped into something that looked disturbingly like a judge's bench and gallery. Shall we discuss the law? The proprietor's courtroom was wrong in every way that mattered. The bench was carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light, and the gallery seats were filled with shadows that whispered in voices I almost recognized. Worst of all, the jury box held 12 figures in the rotted remains of old-fashioned clothes, the souls of people who'd lost cases here before. Court is now in session, the proprietor said, settling onto his stone bench. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority. The case before us today is Patterson versus the sovereign territory of Whiskey Cove, regarding the validity of certain contractual obligations. Sarah and Mike stood on either side of me, still dazed from the sudden transportation. The dead agents Thompson and Martinez took positions as bailiffs, their yellow eyes never leaving us. Now then, the proprietor continued, you claim my contracts might be invalid under federal law. A fascinating theory. Unfortunately for you, I've been perfecting these agreements for over a century with the help of some very talented legal minds. He gestured to the jury box. One of the rotted figures raised its hand in a mockery of recognition. Judge Harrison there ruled on territorial jurisdiction in 1887. Prosecutor Williams established precedent for sole debt inheritance in 1902. Defense attorney Goldman, well, he tried to argue against me in 1924. They all work for me now. But that's exactly the problem, I said, my ATF training finally kicking in. You can't have federal agents enforcing illegal alcohol operations. It violates the basic principle of the law they're sworn to uphold. The proprietor's laugh shook dust from the stone walls. Illegal? My dear boy, nothing I do here is illegal. I have proper federal licensing. He snapped his fingers, and a scroll appeared in the air before us. The paper was yellow with age, but the federal seal at the bottom looked official enough. Special Federal Alcohol Production License, issued in 1863, he read. Authorizes the bearer to produce distilled spirits within the designated territory for, oh, this is interesting, the moral improvement of the local population. I stepped closer to read the document. The language was archaic, but it looked legitimate. Then I saw something that made my heart race. This license expired in 1873, I said. The proprietor's smile faltered for just a moment. Clerical error. The renewal is pending. Pending for over 100 years? I pressed. Under federal law, operation without a valid license makes this an illegal distillery. Any agreements made to protect illegal operations are void, as contracts made for unlawful purposes. The shadows in the gallery began to whisper louder, and several of the jury members turned to look at their master with something like hope in their dead eyes. Furthermore, I continued, drawing on every regulation I'd memorized, and my ATF years, federal agents cannot enter into contracts that conflict with their sworn duties. Any agreement that requires them to ignore federal crimes is automatically void. Thompson stepped forward, his burned face twisting. The proprietor owns our souls. We have no choice. That's where you're wrong, I said. Federal law supersedes supernatural law. If your contract violated your oath of office, it was invalid from the moment you signed it. The proprietor rose from his bench, and his true form began to show through his human disguise. His arms stretched longer, his fingers became claws, and his face pushed forward into something like a wolf's snout. Enough, he roared. I am the law in this territory. No, I said, pulling something from my pocket, the melted remains of Thompson's radio. You're just a squatter with an expired permit. I held up the twisted metal. This radio was destroyed by supernatural means while the agents were on official federal business. That makes this a federal crime scene. And since you've admitted to being responsible, you're under arrest. The proprietor laughed, but it sounded forced now. You can't arrest me, boy. You have no authority here. Actually, I do. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a leather wallet I hadn't opened in years. My old ATF badge, still valid for 24 more hours before the paperwork expired. I'm placing you under federal arrest for destruction of government property, conspiracy to violate federal alcohol laws, and operating an illegal distillery. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The proprietor stumbled backward as if I'd hit him with a physical blow. The stone courtroom began to crack and crumble around us. No, he snarled. The contracts are binding. Contracts made for unlawful purposes are void, I repeated, stepping toward him. Contracts that require federal agents to violate their oaths are void, and contracts signed under duress or fraudulent pretenses are void. Each word hit him like a hammer blow. The shadows in the gallery began to dissolve, and the jury members started to look more human, more alive. You forget, the proprietor hissed, backing toward his still. I have power here. I can destroy you. Maybe, I said. But you can't make me sign your contract, and without that you've got nothing. Sarah suddenly spoke up. Will, The families. What about all the families he's bound with contracts? I looked at the proprietor, whose form was beginning to waver between human and something else. Those contracts were enforced by federal agents acting unlawfully. If the enforcement was illegal, the contracts are unenforceable. The proprietor let out a howl that shattered every jar of moonshine around his still. The liquid inside, the trapped souls, poured out onto the ground and began to take human form. Thompson and Martinez collapsed, their dead bodies finally looking truly dead. But from the spilled moonshine, two other figures emerged, gasping and solid and alive. The real Thompson and Martinez, freed from their liquid prison. "The contracts," the proprietor whispered, his form now flickering like a candle in the wind. "All my contracts. Void," I said firmly. "Every single one." The stone courtroom collapsed completely, leaving us standing in the natural cove beside the now cold still. The proprietor was fading, becoming transparent. "This isn't over," he said, his voice now just an echo. "The families will come back to me. They always do. And when they do, they'll be making their own choices," I said, "not bound by their ancestors' debts." He faded completely, leaving nothing but the smell of sulfur and the sound of wind through the trees. The real Thompson and Martinez needed medical attention. 2 days trapped in supernatural moonshine had left them dehydrated and confused, but alive. We got them stabilized and called for helicopter evacuation from the nearest clearing. While we waited, I destroyed the still. Copper pipes melted down, mash barrels emptied into the stream. The whole operation reduced to scrap metal and spilled grain. It felt good, like cleaning an infection from a wound. "Will," Sarah said as we watched the helicopter lift off with the 2 federal agents. "What happens now? To the families, I mean." I'd been thinking about that. They'll have choices to make. Some of them have been making moonshine for generations. It's all they know. But now they can do it without supernatural debts hanging over their children. Mike, his ankle wrapped in an emergency bandage, was examining the remains of the still. "You really think it's over?" I looked around the cove. The air smelled clean now, just pine and stream water. Birds were singing again, and somewhere in the distance I could hear a squirrel chattering. "For now," I said. "But these mountains are old, and they remember things. Something else might try to move in eventually." "What do we tell people?" Sarah asked. "The official report?" I pulled out my notepad and started writing. 2 federal agents went missing while investigating illegal moonshine operation. Agents were found suffering from dehydration and exposure after being trapped by cave-in. Still was abandoned and has been destroyed. Case closed. "And the rest of it?" "The rest of it stays in the mountains," I said, "where it belongs." We hiked out as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. At the ridge where we'd first spotted the cove, I stopped and looked back. The valley looked peaceful, just green forest and clean water, but I knew I'd be back to check on it regularly. Some things in these mountains are too important to leave unwatched. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've made friends with some of the local families, the ones who were bound by the old contracts. Most of them have gone back to making traditional moonshine, the kind that doesn't cost your soul. A few have given up the trade entirely, started growing ginseng or raising cattle instead. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is blowing just right through Whiskey Cove, I hear laughter echoing off the rocks. Not the terrible hollow laughter of the proprietor. Something else. Something older and more patient. My grandfather was right. Some things have been in these mountains longer than people, and they don't give up easy. They just wait. I still patrol that area regularly, and I've started teaching Sarah and Mike about the old stories, the ones that aren't really stories at all, because someday something new might try to set up shop in those hidden coves, and when it does, we'll be ready. The mountains remember everything. But now, so do we. Last week, I found fresh copper tubing hidden under a rock overhang about 2 miles from the old site. When I touched it, my fingers came away warm, and I could swear I smelled sulfur. I destroyed the tubing and salted the ground around it, the way my grandfather taught me. but I know it's only a matter of time before I find more. Some bargains are too good for people to resist, especially when they're desperate. And there's always something in these mountains willing to make a deal. The difference now is that the law, real law, federal law, is on our side. And as long as I'm wearing this badge, I'll make sure it stays that way. Even if it means going back to that cove again and again, facing whatever new devil thinks it can claim these mountains. After all, someone has to keep watch. Someone has to remember that not all contracts are worth signing, especially the ones written in the dark. My name is William Patterson, and these are my mountains now. My name is Eleanor Prescott, but everyone calls me Ellie. I've been a park ranger for 13 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything the Cherokee National Forest could throw at me. Bears, lost hikers, flash floods, you name it. But nothing prepared me for what happened at Bell Witch Cave in the fall of '83. I moved down here from Boston 5 years ago with a PhD in folklore, drawn to these mountains like a moth to flame. The old stories fascinated me. Cherokee legends, mountain ghost tales, and especially the Bell Witch. You know the story, right? Back in the 1820s, something terrorized the Bell family in Adams, Tennessee. Voices in the walls, objects flying around, a young girl tormented by an invisible force, classic haunting stuff. The thing is, I never believed a word of it. Mass hysteria, I always said. Maybe some teenage pranks mixed with small-town gossip. The Bell Witch was just another tall tale that got bigger with each telling. Bell Witch Cave sits about 3 miles from where the old Bell farm used to be. It's a limestone cave system that winds deep into the mountain, with chambers that echo your voice back in weird, distorted ways. Perfect place for ghost stories, if you ask me. The cave had been a tourist spot for decades, and part of my job was managing the guided tours. That September was hot and muggy, even for Tennessee. The kind of weather that makes your shirt stick to your back and the air feel thick as soup. Thunderstorms rolled through every afternoon, turning the forest into a steamy mess. The cave stayed a cool 55 degrees year-round, which made it popular with visitors trying to escape the heat. I remember the morning it all started because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were usually quiet. A small tour group, maybe 8 people, came through around 10 a.m. Nice folks, a couple families with teenagers, some college kids, stall, Endard Cave tour stuff. But when they came out, something was wrong. The guide, Janet Mills, looked pale as a sheet. She'd been doing cave tours for 15 years and never lost her cool about anything. "Ellie," she said, pulling me aside, "we need to talk." The visitors were clustered near their cars, whispering among themselves. One of the college kids had his phone out, playing something back through the tiny speaker. "What happened in there?" I asked. Janet shook her head. "You're not going to believe this. About halfway through, when we got to Echo Chamber, we heard voices. Voices echo in there, Janet. That's why they call it Echo Chamber. No, not our voices. Someone else's voice. A woman's voice, speaking when none of us were talking." The college kid with the phone walked over. "Ma'am, you need to hear this." He held up his phone, and I could hear the scratchy recording of their tour. Janet's voice explaining the rock formations, the group asking questions, footsteps on stone. Then, clear as day, a woman's voice said, "Get out of my home." The hair on my arm stood up. It sounded like it was coming from inside the cave walls. "Could be audio bleed from another group," I said, but my voice sounded shaky even to me. "There wasn't another group," Janet said. "We were the only people scheduled until this afternoon." I looked at the recording timestamp, 10:47 a.m. The next tour wasn't until 2 p.m. "I want to check something," I told Janet. "Cancel the afternoon tours." She nodded, looking relieved. After the visitors left, I grabbed my equipment and headed into the cave alone. Emergency radio, bright LED headlamp, backup flashlights, first aid kit, standard cave inspection gear. The entrance tunnel sloped down at a gentle angle, the temperature dropping with every step. The cave felt different that day. In 13 years, I'd been through these passages hundreds of times. I knew every twist and turn, every odd-shaped rock formation. But something was off. The air felt heavier, like before a bad storm, and it was too quiet. Even the Constant drip of water seemed muted. I made it to echo chamber without incident. It's a big circular room with a domed ceiling, maybe 30 feet across. The acoustics are amazing. You can whisper on one side and hear it clearly on the other. Perfect natural amphitheater. I tested my radio. Static. That was normal. The limestone played hell with radio signals. Then I heard it. "You shouldn't be here alone." A woman's voice, soft and clear, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I spun around, my headlamp beam dancing across empty stone walls. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The echo of my voice bounced back, and then silence. I checked my watch. 11:15. My hands were shaking a little as I made notes in my logbook. Possible audio phenomenon. Need further investigation. But deep down, I knew this wasn't some natural cave acoustics. Something was very wrong in Bell Witch Cave. I should have left right then. Should have sealed the cave and called for backup. But you have to understand, I'm a scientist. My whole career was built on debunking supernatural nonsense with rational explanations. I wasn't about to let some weird acoustics run me off. Over the next 3 days, I did everything by the book. I brought in recording equipment, temperature sensors, even a geologist from the University of Tennessee to check for settling limestone that might create new sound chambers. Dr. Marcus Webb spent 6 hours in that cave with instruments I couldn't even pronounce the names of. "Structurally sound," he reported. "No recent shifts, no new fissures. Whatever you're hearing, it's not coming from geological activity." The temperature readings were the first real sign something was seriously wrong. Echo chamber was running 20 degrees colder than the rest of the cave system. Not just cool, cold enough to see your breath. And the cold spots moved around like they were alive. On Friday, I brought my colleague Tom Willis down with me for a full inspection. Tom was younger than me, maybe 28, and built like he could wrestle a bear. He'd transferred from Yellowstone the year before, drawn by our cave systems. Good guy, steady nerves, never spooked by anything. We made it to echo chamber without trouble. Tom set up the recording equipment while I took temperature readings. 43 degrees, I said, checking my thermometer. "That's impossible." "Equipment malfunction?" Tom suggested. Then the lights went out. Not the battery-powered headlamps, those kept working. But the installed cave lighting system, which was wired to run continuously, just died. All at once, like someone threw a switch. In the sudden dimness, I heard Tom suck in his breath. "Ellie," he whispered, "look at the wall." I turned my headlamp where he was pointing. Scratched into the limestone, in letters 3 inches tall, were the words, "Betsy Bell." "Those weren't there yesterday," I said. "Are you sure?" I was sure. I'd been studying these walls for 5 years. Every mark, every natural formation. These scratches were fresh. You could see limestone dust on the cave floor beneath them. Then we heard the voice again. "She was just a child," it said. The woman's voice from the recordings, but clearer now. Sadder. "Betsy Bell was just a child when they hurt her." Tom grabbed his radio. "Base, this is Willis. We have a situation in the cave system." Static. "No signal," he muttered. The voice spoke again, and this time it seemed to come from right behind us. "I know you, Eleanor Prescott. I know why you came here. You don't believe in the old stories, do you? You think you're too smart, too educated." I spun around. Nothing but empty cave. "You wrote about me," the voice continued, "in your papers. Called me mass hysteria. Called me a hoax." That hit me like a punch to the gut. I had written about the Bell Witch in my doctoral thesis, academic journals, scholarly papers. I'd spent years debunking the legend. "You studied at Harvard?" the voice said. "Your mother died when you were 12. Cancer. You blamed God, stopped going to church. That's why you became a skeptic, isn't it, Eleanor? Because if there's no supernatural, then there's no God who let your mother die." My knees almost gave out. Nobody knew that. I'd never told anyone about the connection between my mother's death and my academic focus. Hell, I'd barely admitted it to myself. "How?" I whispered. "I know many things," the voice said. I know Tom here is afraid of drowning. Nearly drowned in a lake when he was 8. That's why he transferred away from Yellowstone. Too many rivers. Tom went white. That's not in my personnel file. I never told anyone that. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Our breath came out in visible puffs now. I know about the Cherokee women, the voice continued. The ones buried under this mountain. The ones your government pretends never existed. Who are you? I demanded. Laughter echoed through the chamber, but it didn't sound happy. It sounded like crying. I am the Bell Witch, Eleanor. Kate Batts, as I was in life. But death has taught me things, shown me truths your history books won't tell. Something moved in my peripheral vision. I turned my headlamp, but saw only stone walls. The Bell family, the voice said. They were not the innocent victims your folklore claims. John Bell helped drive my people from their land. Cherokee families lived where his farm stood. 3 women died when they burned the longhouse. 3 Cherokee women pregnant with children they would never birth. The scratches on the wall began to change. New letters appeared as we watched, carved by invisible hands. Ayanna, Sequoia, Galilahi. Cherokee names, Tom breathed. Their names, the voice corrected. My sisters in death. We are bound to this place by blood and injustice. More scratches appeared. 1838 trail of tears. I was Kate Batts in life, yes, but death opened my eyes. I see now why I was drawn to torment the Bell family. It was not just John Bell's cruelty to me. It was his cruelty to all of us. The cave lights suddenly blazed back to life, so bright after the darkness that we both threw up our hands to shield our eyes. When our vision cleared, the walls were covered in new scratches. Dozens of Cherokee names, dates, symbols I didn't recognize, and one message that made my blood run cold. You profit from our graves. Tours will stop. Tom grabbed my arm. We need to get out of here, now. I wanted to argue, to demand more answers. But the temperature was still dropping, and I could feel something building in the air around us, like the pressure before a tornado. We ran. I called in sick the next Monday. Spent the weekend researching Cherokee history, land records, anything I could find about the area before it became Bell's farm. What I found made me sick to my stomach. The records were scattered and incomplete, but the pattern was clear. In 1837, a year before the Trail of Tears, several Cherokee families had been removed from the land that would become the Bell farm. The official reports mentioned resistance and necessary force. 3 Cherokee women were listed as casualties, but their bodies were never recovered. The Bell witch haunting started in 1817, 20 years before that. But what if the timeline was wrong? What if Kate Batts, the old woman John Bell had cheated in a land deal, was just the beginning? What if her spirit had awakened something older, angrier? Tuesday morning, my supervisor Frank Garcia called me into his office. Ellie, we got complaints about the cave tours being canceled, he said. People drove down from Nashville, had reservations. What's going on? I tried to explain without sounding crazy. Equipment failures, structural concern, need for safety inspection. Frank listened with the patience of a man who'd heard every excuse in the book. Get it sorted out, he said finally. Cave tours are big revenue for the park. Can't keep them closed much longer. That afternoon, I went back to the cave with a full investigation team. Tom, Janet, plus 2 maintenance guys and a safety inspector from the State Park Service. If we were going to reopen the tours, I wanted witnesses for whatever happened next. The cave felt normal at first. Temperature readings were back to the usual 55 degrees. No cold spots, no strange voices. The scratched names were still there, but they looked old now, weathered like they'd been there for years. Must have been temperature fluctuations, the state inspector said, making notes on his clipboard. Limestone can expand and contract, create weird acoustic effects. I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. We made it all the way to the back chambers without incident. These were the parts of the cave system tourists never saw. Narrow passages that required crawling, chambers you reached by rope. Tom and I had mapped them all during my first year at the park. In the deepest chamber, we found something new, It was a perfect circle of stones, each one about the size of a dinner plate, arranged around a natural depression in the cave floor. Inside the circle were objects that shouldn't have existed: pottery shards, bone tools, bits of woven cloth. All of it perfectly preserved despite the cave's humidity. Cherokee artifacts, Janet breathed. She'd grown up in the area, knew the local history better than any of us. The state inspector bent down for a closer look. "How long have these been here?" "They weren't here last month," I said. "I mapped every inch of this cave system." One of the maintenance guys, a heavy-set man named Dale, laughed nervously. "Maybe some reenactors left them, trying to make the cave tours more exciting." But I could see the age on those artifacts. The pottery was cracked but not broken. The bone tools were, smoothed by hands that had been dust for more than a century. This wasn't some tourist prop. This was a real burial site. That's when the temperature started dropping again. "Anyone else feel that?" Tom asked. The air got so cold so fast that condensation began forming on the cave walls. Our flashlight beams caught the moisture, making everything look wet and strange. Then we heard the voices. Not just one woman's voice this time, but three. Speaking in a language none of us recognized, but somehow I knew it was Cherokee. The voices were coming from the stone circle, rising from the artifacts like steam. Dale backed toward the tunnel entrance. "I don't like this." The state inspector was still scribbling notes, trying to be professional, even as his breath came out in white puffs. Probably just air pressure changes from the storm system moving through. But there was no storm system. Outside, it was a clear September afternoon. The Cherokee voices got louder, more urgent. They weren't speaking to us. They were speaking to each other, like they were having a conversation we couldn't understand. Then one voice broke off and spoke in English. "You bring strangers to our resting place." It was the same woman's voice from before, but now I could hear others underneath it. Harmonies of pain and anger that made my chest feel tight. "We tried to warn you," the voice continued. "Tours will stop. This place is not for your profit." The artifacts in the stone circle began to glow, not bright like electric lights, but soft like moonlight. The pottery shards moved by themselves, sliding across the cave floor to form patterns I didn't recognize. Dale bolted, just turned and ran back toward the entrance, his heavy boots echoing through the tunnels. The state inspector wasn't far behind, abandoning his professional composure as the temperature hit freezing. "Wait!" I called after two. "Hem!" But Tom grabbed my arm. "Let them go," he said quietly. "Look." The bone tools were moving now, arranging themselves around the pottery in what looked like a ritual pattern, and in the center of the circle, the cave floor was changing. The limestone was becoming transparent, like looking through clear ice. Beneath it, we could see them. 3 women lying on their sides in the earth. Their bodies were perfectly preserved, dressed in traditional Cherokee clothing, but their eyes were open, and they were looking right at us. Janet made a sound like a sob. "Oh God, they're still here. They've been here all along." One of the women, the youngest-looking one, raised her hand. Her lips moved, and I heard the Bell Witch's voice. "We cannot rest while our killer's descendants profit from our pain. The cave tours, the Bell Witch legend, it all feeds on our suffering." "What do you want?" I whispered. "Justice," all 3 voices said in unison. "Truth. An end to the lies." The glowing artifacts rose from the cave floor, floating in the air like leaves caught in an invisible wind. The temperature was so cold now that ice was forming on the cave walls. "The Bell family story is not what your books say," the voices continued. "John Bell did not just cheat Kate Batts. He murdered Cherokee families for their land. We are bound here by blood and earth until the truth is told." Tom was pulling on my jacket. "Ellie, we have to go. The tunnel might ice over." But I couldn't move. I was staring at those 3 women beneath the transparent cave floor, watching their lips move in unison as the Bell Witch's voice filled the chamber. "You will help us, Eleanor Prescott. You will tell our story, or the tours will never be safe again." The artifacts crashed to the cave floor all at once, the sound echoing through the tunnels like gunshots. The ice on the walls began to crack and fall. We ran. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those three women looking up at me through the cave floor. Their eyes were so sad, but also angry. The kind of anger that builds over more than a century of being ignored. I spent the next day in the park library, going through historical records I'd never bothered to check before. Land deeds, county records, even old newspaper clippings from the 1830s. The picture that emerged made me sick. John Bell hadn't just bought Cherokee land. He'd actively participated in driving families off their property. There were records of disputes and necessary removals. 3 Cherokee women were listed as casualties of resistance in 1837, but their bodies were never found or returned to their families. Kate Batts, the old woman Bell cheated, had been married to a Cherokee man. That detail never made it into the popular Bell witch stories, but it was right there in the marriage records. She'd lived between 2 worlds, and when Bell destroyed her life, something darker had awakened. The Cherokee women buried under the cave weren't just random victims. They were relatives of Kate Batts' husband. Family. Wednesday morning, Frank Garcia called me into his office again. This time, he wasn't alone. There were 2 men in suits, tourism board officials, and Dale, the maintenance worker who'd run from the cave. "Ellie," Frank said carefully, "Dale here says you've been staging some kind of show in the cave system. Ghost effects, moving objects, that kind of thing." Dale wouldn't meet my eyes. "I saw what I saw, stuff floating around, weird voices. She's trying to scare people away from the tours." The tourism board guys looked serious. "Ms. Prescott, cave tours generate significant revenue for the region. If there are safety concerns, we need to address them properly, not with amateur theater." I tried to explain, but how do you tell business suits that Cherokee ghosts are buried under their tourist attraction? They listened with the polite attention of people who've already made up their mind. "Just take a week off," Frank said finally. "Paid leave. When you come back, cave tours resume normal schedule." I drove home feeling defeated, but that night, Tom called me. "Ellie, you need to get down here right now." "What's wrong?" "Janet's in the hospital. She went into the cave alone this afternoon, said she wanted to check something. Rangers found her unconscious in echo chamber 3 hours later." I made it to the hospital in 20 minutes. Janet was awake but shaky, with scratches on her arms that looked like the Cherokee symbols I'd seen carved in the cave walls. "They showed me things," she whispered when I sat down beside her bed. "The Cherokee women. They showed me what really happened." "What did you see?" "The longhouse burning. The women trying to protect their children. Bell and his men." She closed her eyes. "They didn't just kill them, Ellie. They tortured them first, made examples, and then they buried the bodies in the cave so no one would find them." The scratches on her arms were swollen and red. When I looked closer, I could see they spelled out words in Cherokee. Tom had brought a Cherokee language guide from the park library. "Ayana, Sequoia, Galilahi," he read slowly. "The 3 names from the cave wall. They want their story told," Janet said. "They're tired of being forgotten while people make money off their pain." That night, I made my decision. I was going back into the cave system, alone, to face whatever was down there. If the Cherokee women wanted justice, wanted their story told, then I would find a way to give it to them. I waited until midnight, then drove back to the park. The cave entrance was locked, but I had keys. I went in with minimal equipment, just a headlamp, emergency radio, and my notebook. The cave felt different at night, more alive somehow. The air hummed with energy, and I could hear sounds that weren't quite echoes. Whispers in Cherokee, footsteps on stone, the soft weeping of women who'd been crying for more than a century. When I reached Echo Chamber, they were waiting for me, all 3 of them, standing in the middle of the chamber like they'd been there all along. They looked solid, real, dressed in traditional Cherokee clothing, but with their faces marked by violence. The youngest one, who couldn't have been more than 16, had burn marks on her arms. "You came," said the oldest woman, and I realized her voice was the one I'd been hearing all along. The Bell Witch voice, but cleaner now, more herself. "My name is Ayana," she continued. "In your language, it means eternal blossom. This is my daughter Sequoia, and my sister's daughter Galilahi. We have been waiting so long for someone to see us." "What happened to you?" I asked. "John Bell wanted our land," Sequoia said. Her voice was young but filled with old pain. "Our families had lived there for generations. It was good farmland near the river. Bell offered to buy it, but when we refused, he came with men and guns. They burned our longhouse while we were inside," Galilahi added. "We tried to save the children, but the fire was too fast. The men waited outside with rifles, shooting anyone who escaped the flames." "Kate Batts was my husband's cousin," Ayana explained. "When she heard what happened, she cursed John Bell and his family. But her spirit was tied to ours by blood and grief. We became one force, one voice for justice." The chamber began to glow with the same soft light I'd seen around the artifacts. But now I could see the source. It was coming from the women themselves, from their pain and anger transformed into something stronger. "For more than a century, we have watched people profit from our suffering," Ayana said. "The Bell Witch legend, the ghost tours, the books and movies, all of it built on lies. They made Kate Batts into a monster and forgot about us entirely." "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Tell the truth," all three voices said together. "Let the world know that we existed. Let them know what really happened. And stop the cave tours that profit from our graves." The glow got brighter, and I realized they were starting to fade. Not disappearing, but becoming translucent. "Our time grows short," Ayana said. "The ritual circle you found, those are our burial goods, preserved by our spirits. If the tours continue, if strangers keep disturbing our rest, we will be forced to defend ourselves." "More people will be hurt," Sequoia added. "We don't want that, but we cannot rest while our pain is turned into entertainment." I understood what they were asking. It meant ending my career, probably. No park service would keep a ranger who shut down profitable tours for supernatural reasons. But looking at these three women, seeing the sadness and dignity in their faces, I knew I didn't have a choice. "I'll do it," I said. "I'll tell your story." The women smiled for the first time since I'd met them. As they faded completely from view, Ayana's voice whispered one last message. "Thank you, Eleanor. Now we can finally rest." It took 3 months to make it all official. 3 months of fighting with park officials, tourism boards, and local politicians who didn't want to hear about Cherokee burial sites disrupting their revenue stream. But Janet backed up my story, and Tom helped me document everything we'd found in the caves. The final straw came when a geology team from the University of Tennessee confirmed what we'd suspected. The cave system sat directly on top of an unmarked Cherokee burial ground. Ground-penetrating radar found at least 12 sets of human remains, along with artifacts dating back more than 200 years. The cave tours were permanently suspended. The burial site was sealed and turned over to the Cherokee Nation for proper ceremonial treatment. I submitted my resignation the day they announced the closure, knowing Frank Garcia would have fired me anyway. But something good came out of it. My report on the Bell Witch case became the foundation for a new historical investigation into Cherokee land, Sit, Isers in the 1830s. Universities started sending graduate students to research the real story behind the legend. The Cherokee Nation was able to reclaim and properly bury their ancestors. As for me, I moved back to Boston and took a job with the Smithsonian, documenting Native American historical sites. It's quieter work, but more honest. I never did write that debunking paper about the Bell Witch I'd been planning. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about Ayana, Sequoia, and Galilahi. I hope they found peace. The Cherokee Nation told me that according to their beliefs, spirits can't rest until their stories are heard and their deaths are acknowledged. I like to think that by telling their truth, I helped them find the peace they'd been seeking for more than a century. But I also know there are other places like Bell Witch Cave, other tourist attractions built on forgotten graves, other legends that hide uncomfortable truths about our history. The Bell Witch may be at rest now, but there are other spirits still waiting for someone to listen to their stories. The Cherokee elders who handled the burial ceremony told me something I'll never forget. The land remembers everything, even when people choose to forget. And sometimes, when the forgetting goes on too long, the land finds ways to remind us. I keep that in mind now, in my new job, because every historical site has its ghosts, and some of them are still waiting for justice. Tom Willis transferred to the Pacific Northwest last spring. He sends me postcards sometimes, pictures of mountains and forests, always with a note saying how quiet and peaceful everything is. I'm happy for him. Not everyone who encounters the supernatural comes out of it wanting to learn more. Janet stayed with the Park Service but moved to a different department. Environmental education, no more cave tours. She told me once that she still has dreams about the women in the burial chamber, but they're good dreams now. Dreams where the women are smiling and at peace. The Bell Witch legend continues, of course. There are still books and websites that tell the old version of the story. John Bell as innocent victim, Kate Batts as vengeful witch. But now there are other versions too. Cherokee voices sharing the truth their grandmothers passed down in whispered stories. Truth has a way of surviving, even when it's buried deep underground. As for whether I believe in ghosts now, well, that's a harder question than you might think. I know what I saw in that cave. I know those 3 women were as real as anything I've ever encountered. But belief isn't really the right word for it. Knowledge is better. I know that some injustices echo through time until they find someone willing to listen. I know that the dead don't rest easy when their stories are forgotten or twisted into entertainment. And I know that sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you get the chance to help set things right. The Bell Witch's kin are at peace now. But there are other kin out there, still waiting, still watching, still remembering. My name is Bobby McGinnis, and I've been a forest ranger for 22 years now. Before that, I spent 15 years working the coal mines here in West Virginia, just like my daddy and his daddy before him. I know these mountains better than most folks know their own backyard. It was November of 1988 when I got the call that changed everything. The cleanup crew working on the old Jefferson mine site had stopped showing up for work. Their foreman, a tough old bird named Pete Harrison, called my office that Tuesday morning. "Bobby, we got a problem," Pete said, his voice shaky in a way I'd never heard before. "My boys won't go back down there. They're saying the mine's active." I laughed at first. "Pete, that mine's been sealed for 20 years. Nothing's active about it except maybe some bats." "That's what I told them," Pete said. "But they swear they're hearing voices down there, seeing lights moving around in the shafts. And yesterday, Tommy Briggs came up covered in coal dust, talking about men with pickaxes working the walls." I knew Pete wasn't the type to make things up. He'd been in the mining business longer than I had, and he didn't scare easy. If his crew was spooked, something was definitely wrong. The Jefferson mine had been closed since 1967 after a terrible accident. 78 men died when the main shaft collapsed. The company sealed it up fast, said it was too dangerous to recover the bodies. My brother Danny was one of those men. He was only 19, just married with a baby on the way. I drove out there that afternoon in my Forest Service truck. The November air was cold and damp, with thick fog rolling through the valleys. The old mining road was barely there anymore, overgrown with weeds and small trees. I had to park a quarter-mile away and walk in. The mine entrance was a black hole in the mountainside covered by a heavy steel gate that should have been locked tight. But as I got closer, I could see the gate was hanging open. The chain that held it was cut clean through, the metal still bright where the bolt cutters had bit. I had all my safety gear with me: gas detector, flashlights, rope, and a radio that probably wouldn't work this deep in the mountains. The company had left some old mining equipment scattered around the entrance, but it was all rusted and broken. At least it should have been. But when I looked closer, I saw fresh oil stains on the ground. Some of the equipment looked like it had been used recently. There were even fresh tire tracks in the mud, though I hadn't seen any other vehicles on my way in. I called out, "Hello? Anyone in there? This is Ranger McGinnis with the Forest Service." My voice echoed back from deep in the mine, but there was something else too. A sound like metal hitting rock, rhythmic and steady, like someone was working down there. The gas detector on my belt stayed quiet, so the air was safe enough. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped through the gate. The mine tunnel stretched out in front of me, disappearing into darkness. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, and my footsteps sounded too loud. 20 feet in, I found the first thing that made my blood run cold. On the wall, someone had written in fresh coal dust, "Day shift, November 15th, 1967. Still working, still digging." That was the day of the cave-in, the day my brother died. I should have turned around right then, should have called for backup, or at least told someone where I was going. But I kept thinking about Danny, about how he'd never made it home that last day. And if someone was playing games in his grave, I needed to know who. The tunnel split into 3 passages about 50 yards in. The main shaft went straight down into the mountain. The other 2 curved left and right, following, which the coal seams. I could hear that metal-on-rock sound coming from the right passage, steady as a heartbeat. My flashlight beam danced ahead of me as I followed the sound. The walls were carved rough from the rock, with old wooden support beams every few yards. Some of them looked ready to collapse, but others seemed solid as the day they were put in. That's when I saw the first impossible thing. One of the support beams had fresh axe marks on it, and there were wood shavings on the ground that hadn't had time to get dusty. But the beam itself was clearly 40 years old, weathered and stained with decades of mine water. The metal sounds were getting louder now, and I could hear something else underneath them. Voices, too faint to make out words, but definitely human. Men talking and calling to each other the way miners do when they're working. I rounded a corner and saw light ahead. Not electric light, but the warm yellow glow of oil lamps. The kind we used in the old days, before the mine had proper lighting. I stopped dead in my tracks. Someone was definitely down here, and they were using old mining equipment. Maybe it was treasure hunters, or people looking to steal copper wire from the abandoned electrical systems. But why would they use oil lamps instead of modern flashlights? The smart thing would have been to go back and call the sheriff, but I was already this far in, and I needed to see what was happening in my brother's grave. I turned off my flashlight and crept forward in the darkness, following the sound of voices and the glow of lamplight. As I got closer to the light, the voices became clearer. Men talking about work, about how deep they'd dug that day, about quotas and shift changes. Normal mining talk, except for one thing. They were using words and phrases I hadn't heard since I was a kid working alongside the old-timers. "This seam's running deeper than we thought," one voice said. "Gonna need more timber for the supports." "Boss wants us to push harder," another replied. "Says the company's breathing down his neck about productivity on numbers." I pressed myself against the tunnel wall and peered around the corner. What I saw made me question my own eyes. 6 men in mining gear were working the coal face with hand tools, pickaxes, shovels, and hammers. They wore the old-style mining clothes I remembered from my youth. Canvas pants, heavy work shirts, and those leather hard hats we used before modern safety equipment. Their oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls as they worked. But here's what made my skin crawl. I could see right through them. They were like old black and white photographs come to life, moving and talking, but not quite solid. When one of them walked in front of a lamp, the light shone through his body like he was made of smoke. I rubbed my eyes hard, thinking maybe the mine gases were getting to me despite what my detector said. But when I looked again, they were still there, still working. One of them straightened up and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. He was young, maybe 20, with the kind of thin build that comes from growing up poor in the mountains. When he turned toward where I was hiding, my heart nearly stopped. It was Danny, my little brother, exactly as he'd looked the last time I saw him alive. "Getting close to quitting time," Danny said to the others. "Mary's making pot roast tonight, and I promised I wouldn't be late." The other miners laughed. "You and that new wife of yours," one said, "act like you're still on your honeymoon." "Still am," Danny grinned. Baby's due in spring. Gonna be the first McGinnis born outside these mines. I wanted to call out to him, to run over and grab him, to tell him to get out before the cave-in. But I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe properly. This was impossible. Danny had been dead for 21 years. One of the miners, an older man with a gray beard, suddenly looked up from his work. "You boys hear that?" They all stopped working and listened. The mine went dead quiet except for the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. "Hear what, Frank?" Danny asked. "Thought I heard breathing that wasn't ours," Frank said. He held up his oil lamp and looked around. "Someone else down here." I held my breath and pressed harder against the wall, hoping the shadows would hide me. But Frank's lamplight swept closer to where I was crouched. "There," Frank said, pointing right at me. "Someone's watching us." All 6 miners turned to look at me. Their faces were curious rather than angry, like they were just surprised to see company. "Well, come on out," Frank called. "No point hiding. We know you're there." I didn't have much choice. I stepped into the circle of their lamplight, my hands raised to show I wasn't dangerous. "I'm Bobby McGinnis, Forest Service Ranger. I'm just checking on reports of activity in the mine." Danny's face lit up with recognition. "Bobby? Bobby, is that you?" He started walking toward me, and I could see the joy in his eyes. But as he got closer, I noticed other things too. His clothes were dirty with coal dust, but underneath the dirt, they looked fresh. His face was young and unmarked by the years that should have aged him. "Danny, you died," I whispered. "The mine collapsed in '67. You've been gone for 21 years. Danny stopped walking and looked confused. "What are you talking about?" "It's November 15th, 1967. I just started my shift an hour ago." The other miners gathered around us, their oil lamps creating a circle of flickering light. They all looked as confused as Danny. "Son," Frank said to me, "I don't know what you're talking about. This mine's been running steady for 5 years now. We got quotas to meet and families to feed." I looked at their faces, all of them sincere and puzzled. They really believed it was still 1967. They had no idea they were dead. "Listen," I said carefully. "I need you all to come with me, up to the surface. There's something you need to see." "Can't leave during shift time," one of the younger men here said. "Boss would dock our pay." "The boss won't mind," I said. "Trust me." But even as I said it, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps coming down the main tunnel, heavy work boots on stone, and with them, a voice I hoped I'd never hear again. "Where are my workers?" the voice boomed. "Shift's not over for another 2 hours." The miners all tensed up, looking scared. Danny grabbed my arm. "It's Mr. Garrett, the mine supervisor. Bobby, you need to hide. He doesn't like visitors during work hours." A man stepped into the lamplight, wearing a dark suit and carrying a clipboard. He was solid, not see-through like the miners, and his eyes glowed with a cold, unnatural light. "McGinnis," Garrett said, looking right at me. "I should have known. Always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, just like your brother." "You're supposed to be dead too," I said. "The cave-in killed everyone." Garrett smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp. "Oh, I died all right. But death is no excuse for stopping work. These men have quotas to meet, and by God, they're going to meet them." He turned to the miners. "Back to work, all of you. We've got coal to dig." "But Mr. Garrett," Danny said, "it's almost time to—" "Time for nothing," Garrett roared. "You'll work until I say you stop. You'll work until your debt is paid. You'll work forever if that's what it takes." The miners looked terrified, but they started picking up their tools. Danny gave me one last confused look before he turned back to the coalface. "No," I said, stepping forward. "Danny, don't listen to him. You don't have to work anymore. You're free." Garrett laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Free? McGinnis, these men died in my mine. That makes them mine forever. And now that you're here, you can join them." The oil lamps suddenly flared brighter, and I saw more figures moving in the tunnels around us. Dozens of miners, all dead, all carrying tools, all walking toward where we stood. I ran. I stumbled through the dark tunnels, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I tried. to find my way back to the entrance. Behind me, I could hear Garrett's voice echoing off the walls, commanding his dead workers to find me. "Bring him back," Garrett shouted. "No one leaves my mine without permission." The sound of footsteps followed me, dozens of boots on stone, but when I looked back, I saw something that made me run even faster. The dead miners were walking through the solid rock walls like they weren't even there. They could take shortcuts I couldn't, and they were gaining on me. I took a wrong turn and found myself in a part of the mine I didn't recognize. The tunnel was smaller here, with newer wooden supports that looked like they'd been put in yesterday. Fresh coal dust covered everything, and there were modern tools scattered on the ground, the kind the cleanup crew had been using. That's when I found Tommy Briggs. He was sitting against the wall, staring at nothing, completely covered in black coal dust, just like Pete had described. But Tommy wasn't moving, wasn't even breathing. When I shined my light on him, I saw why. His eyes were solid black, like they'd been filled with coal dust from the inside. And in his hand was a pickaxe that looked like it had been dug up from 1967. "Tommy?" I whispered, but I knew he couldn't hear me. Something touched my shoulder, and I spun around to find Danny standing behind me. Up close, I could see that he wasn't quite right. His skin was too pale, and when he breathed, coal dust puffed out of his mouth like smoke. "Bobby, you need to stay," Danny said. "Mr. Garrett says the mine needs more workers, says the company's behind on production." "Danny, listen to me," I said. "You died 21 years ago. This isn't real. You don't have to work for him anymore." Danny looked confused for a moment, like he was trying to remember something. But Mary's making pot roast. I promised I'd be home. "Mary's been dead for 10 years, Danny. Cancer. And your baby, your daughter Sarah, she's grown up now, has kids of her own." For just a second, Danny's face changed. The confusion cleared, and I saw recognition in his eyes. Real recognition, not the hollow stare of the other miners. "Bobby," he whispered, "what happened to us?" But before I could answer, Garrett's voice boomed through the tunnels. "McGinnis, stop filling my workers with lies." The mine shook, and chunks of rock fell from the ceiling. In the distance, I could hear the sound of the cave-in happening again. The same disaster that had killed these men in 1967, playing over and over like a broken record. "The collapse," Danny said, his eyes widening with memory. "I remember now. The warning signs were there all week. The supports were cracking, but Garrett made us keep working, said the company needed the coal." More miners appeared around us, and I could see the same recognition starting to dawn in their eyes. They were remembering how they really died. "He killed us," one of them said. "Killed us for coal." "And now he's trying to kill others," I said, looking at Tommy Briggs' motionless form. Garrett materialized out of the darkness, his eyes burning with rage. "Enough," he screamed. "These men work for me. They died in my mine, which makes them my property." "Nobody owns the dead," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Garrett laughed. "Is that what you think? I made a deal, McGinnis. The company needed coal, and I promised them they'd get it. Death was just a temporary setback." "What kind of deal?" "The kind that keeps me in charge down here forever. These men will dig coal until the end of time, and every piece they mine feeds the company's profits, even from beyond the grave." I looked around at the dead miners, at my brother, at Tommy Briggs sitting there like a living corpse. "You're making new workers," I realized. "That's why the cleanup crew quit. You're trying to add to your workforce." "Smart boy," Garrett sneered. "The old workers are getting unreliable, starting to remember things they shouldn't. I need fresh blood." He raised his hand, and suddenly I couldn't move. My feet were stuck to the ground like they'd grown roots, and I could feel something cold creeping up my legs. "Don't worry," Garrett said. "It only hurts for a moment. Then you'll be mine forever." The cold was spreading through my body, and I could feel my strength draining away. Around me, the miners were watching with sad, dead eyes. They wanted to help, but they were trapped just like I was about to be. That's when I remembered something my grandfather used to tell me, back when I was little and scared of the dark places in the mines. "The dead can't hold you if you don't let them," I said, fighting against the cold that was trying to claim me. Garrett frowned. What? I looked at Danny, at Frank, at all the miners who'd been trapped here for 21 years. You don't have to work for him anymore. You died paying for his greed. You don't owe him anything else. They work for me! Garrett screamed. But I could hear something else in his voice now. Fear. No, Danny said, stepping forward. We don't. He picked up his pickaxe, but instead of turning back to the coal face, he raised it toward Garrett. We died because you made us work in unsafe conditions. We died because you cared more about coal than our lives. The other miners started nodding, picking up their tools. Frank stepped beside Danny. My wife waited 5 years for my body to be recovered. 5 years before she could bury me proper. The company never paid our families a dime, another miner added. Claimed it was an accident, not their fault. Garrett was backing away now, his confident smile replaced by panic. You can't. The deal was made. You belong to the mine. We belong to ourselves, Danny said. And he swung his pickaxe. The ghostly tool passed right through Garrett, but something important happened. The mine supervisor flickered, like a TV with bad reception, and for a moment I could see through him too. The cold grip on my legs loosened, and I could move again. Hit him again, I shouted. All of you! The dead miners raised their tools and struck at Garrett over and over. Each blow made him weaker, more transparent. The mine began to shake again, but this time it felt different. Not like a collapse, but like something breaking free. Garrett let out a scream that echoed through every tunnel, and then he was gone. Just gone. The miners stood there for a moment, looking at each other like they weren't sure what to do next. Then Danny turned to me. Bobby, he said, I think it's time for us to go home. The mine was falling apart around us. Not collapsing like in 1967, but dissolving, like it was made of sand and someone had poured water on it. The walls were becoming transparent, and I could see through them to empty mountainside. What's happening? I asked. Frank, the old miner with the gray beard, smiled for the first time since I'd met him. We're being set free, son. The mine was never really here, not the way we were trapped in it. It was just his will holding us. The other miners were fading too, becoming more transparent with each passing second. But they looked peaceful, not scared. Danny, I said, I need to know about the company. Are they still profiting from this somehow? My brother nodded. Every piece of coal we mined went somewhere, even the ghost coal. There's people up there who made deals with Garrett who knew what was happening down here. Who? Same company that owns the cleanup contract, Danny said. Jefferson Mountain Coal. They never really went out of business, just changed names. They've been using us to mine coal that doesn't exist on paper. No workers to pay, no safety regulations to follow. Pure profit. That made terrible sense. The cleanup crew wasn't really cleaning up. They were harvesting supernatural coal that the dead miners had been digging for decades. Can you prove it? I asked, pointed to a pile of documents near where Tommy Briggs sat motionless. Garrett kept records, had to for the company. Everything's there. I grabbed the papers just as the mine gave another shudder. The documents were real, solid, not ghostly at all. Contracts, shipping manifests, payment records going back 20 years. Jefferson Mountain Coal had been selling reclaimed coal from the sealed mine, using it to supplement their legal operations. You have to stop them, Danny said. His voice was getting fainter as his form became more transparent. Have to make sure nobody else gets trapped like we were. I will, I promised. But Danny, what about you? Where will you go? He smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the 19-year-old kid who'd gone to work that last day in 1967. Home, he said simply. Gonna see Mary and meet my grandbabies. The other miners were disappearing one by one, fading away with peaceful expressions on their faces. Each time one vanished completely, a piece of the mine went with him until the tunnels were becoming Swiss cheese, full of holes that showed the real forest outside. I ran toward the entrance, carrying the documents and dragging Tommy Briggs with me. He was still alive but completely unresponsive, like his mind was trapped somewhere else. I managed to get him up and over my shoulder in a fireman's carry, praying that whatever Garrett had done to him wasn't permanent. The mine entrance was dissolving too, the steel gate rusting away to nothing as I watched. I stumbled out into the cold November air just as the entire mountainside shimmered and settled back into ordinary rock and earth. I laid Tommy down on the ground and checked his pulse. Still alive, but those black eyes hadn't changed. I radioed for an ambulance, then called Pete Harrison. "Pete, it's Bobby. I found Tommy." "Thank God," Pete said. "Is he okay?" Looked at Tommy's coal dust-filled eyes. "I don't know, but Pete, I need you to do something. Don't let your crew go back to that site. Ever. And if anyone from Jefferson Mountain Coal shows up asking questions, you call me immediately." "What did you find down there, Bobby?" I looked at the documents in my hand, then at the mountainside where the mine entrance had been. There was nothing there now but solid rock and a few old rusted pieces of equipment. "Enough," I said. I found enough. The ambulance came and took Tommy to the hospital. The doctors couldn't explain his condition. Physically he was fine, but mentally he was somewhere else entirely. His eyes stayed black for 3 days, and when they finally cleared, he couldn't remember anything about the mine. He quit the cleanup crew and moved to Florida, said he never wanted to see a coal mine again as long as he lived. I spent the next week studying those documents. The paper trail was damning. Jefferson Mountain Coal had been operating an illegal mining operation using the sealed mine as a front. They'd been paying Garrett, even though he'd been officially dead for 21 years. The company executives had to know something supernatural was going on, but they didn't care as long as the profits kept coming. I turned the documents over to the FBI. It took 6 months, but they eventually arrested 5 executives and shut down Jefferson Mountain Coal permanently. The official story was corporate fraud and illegal mining operations. Nobody talked about the supernatural elements, and I didn't volunteer that information, but I kept one document for myself, a letter Danny had written to Mary the day he died, a letter that had never been mailed. I drove to the cemetery where Mary was buried and left it on her grave, along with some flowers. The mine site was declared permanently off-limits and sealed with concrete, and a memorial was put up listing the names of the 78 miners who died in 1967. Danny's name was right there at the top, along with all his friends who'd finally found peace. It's been 5 years since the mine incident, and I still work as a forest ranger in West Virginia. People sometimes ask me about that day, about what really happened to the cleanup crew, and why Jefferson Mountain Coal went out of business so suddenly. I tell them it was just corporate corruption and unsafe working conditions, the same things that have been killing miners in these mountains for over a century. But I know the truth is more complicated than that. Sometimes, late at night when I'm patrolling the mountain roads, I'll drive past the old mine site. The concrete seal is still there, solid and unbroken. But occasionally, just for a moment, I'll catch a glimpse of light coming from inside the mountain. Warm, yellow light, like oil lamps. I don't stop to investigate anymore. I've learned that some things are better left alone. The documents I found in the mine led to more than just arrests. They revealed a network of similar operations across Appalachia, old mining companies that had found ways to profit from tragedy, to squeeze money from the graves of workers who died for someone else's greed. Most of them shut down rather than face investigation. Tommy Briggs never fully recovered. He lives in a little house near Tampa now, works at a hardware store, and won't talk about what happened to him in the mine. But sometimes he calls me, usually late at night, and tells me about his dreams. He dreams about men with pickaxes, about endless tunnels full of coal dust, about voices calling to him from underground. "They're still down there, aren't they?" he asked me during one of those calls. "No," I told him, and I meant it. "The men who were trapped are free now. They've gone home." "Then who's calling to me?" I didn't have an answer for that, because the truth is, I don't think we got all of them. Companies like Jefferson Mountain Coal operated for decades, using supernorms, natural labor to maximize their profits. There might be dozens of sealed mines across the country where the dead are still working, still trapped by greed and corporate indifference. Danny and his crew found peace because they remembered how they died, remembered that they didn't owe Garrett or the company anything more. But there might be others who haven't figured that out yet. Others who are still digging coal in mines that don't exist, creating wealth for people who see them as nothing more than unpaid labor. I've started keeping track of reports from other mining areas, cleanup crews that quit suddenly, environmental teams that refuse to finish their work, stories of voices and lights in abandoned mines. There are more than I'd like to admit. Last week, I got a call from a ranger in Kentucky. His cleanup crew found fresh coal dust in a mine that's been sealed since 1954. The crew foreman swears he heard voices singing old mining songs when he got close to the entrance. I told him I'd drive up next weekend to take a look. Because here's what I learned in that mine with Danny and the others. The dead don't rest easy when they died for someone else's greed. And as long as there are people willing to profit from that tragedy, there will be spirits trapped in the darkness, working shifts that never end, digging coal that turns to dust in their hands. My brother and his friends found freedom, but they were the lucky ones. They had someone who remembered them, someone who cared enough to help them understand what had happened. Others might not be so fortunate. So I keep patrolling these mountains, keep watching for signs that the past isn't staying buried. Because somebody has to. Somebody has to make sure that when the dead finally realize they don't have to work anymore, there's someone there to help them find their way home. The coal companies want us to forget about the miners who died in their tunnels. They want us to think of those deaths as ancient history, unfortunate accidents that have nothing to do with modern business. But I know better. My name is Catherine O'Brien, but everyone calls me Cat. I've been a forest ranger for 16 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. I was wrong. It was early April 1972, and I was heading into Ramp Hollow in the Monongahela National Forest. The locals had been coming to me with stories that made no sense. They said something was guarding the wild ramp patches, the best ones, where families had been gathering for generations. Now, I'm a botanist by training. I study plants, not monsters. And ramps, those wild onions that grow in the mountains, they're my specialty. Every spring, people come from all over to dig them up. It's tradition, older than the state itself. So when the ramp diggers started telling me about some huge creature protecting the plants, I figured they'd been hitting the moonshine too hard. But I had to check it out. It's my job to protect the forest and its plants. If there really was a bear or something scaring people away from the ramp patches, I needed to know about it. The walk into Ramp Hollow takes about 2 hours from the nearest road. The trail winds down through thick trees that block out most of the sun, even in the middle of the day. The deeper you go, the quieter it gets. No bird songs, no squirrels chattering, just your boots on the dirt and the sound of your own breathing. I'd been to this hollow dozens of times before. It's special because the ramps grow better here than anywhere else in the forest. The soil is rich and dark, and the plants grow thick as carpet in some spots. Cherokee used to camp here in the old days, gathering plants for food and medicine. You can still find pieces of their old pottery if you know where to look. As I got closer to the main ramp patches, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. The plants were arranged in perfect circles, like someone had planted them on purpose. But ramps don't grow like that. They spread out random-like, following water and good soil. I knelt down to examine one of the circles. The plants were huge, bigger than any wild ramps I'd ever seen. Their leaves were thick and healthy, almost glowing green in the filtered sunlight. But the really strange thing was the soil around them. It was different from the rest of the hollow. Darker, richer, like it had been specially prepared. I pulled out my notebook and started writing down what I saw. That's when I noticed my plant press was missing from my backpack. I always carried it with me, a wooden frame for drying plant samples. I could have sworn I'd packed it that morning. I found it 20 feet away, crushed flat as a pancake. The wooden frame was splintered like someone had stepped on it with a giant boot, but there were no boot prints around it, just some marks in the soft dirt that looked almost like claw scratches. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I'd been alone in these woods thousands of times, but suddenly I felt like someone was watching me. I looked around but saw nothing except trees and shadows. That's when I heard it. A low rumbling sound, like a bear growling, but deeper, much deeper. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees. I grabbed my gear and got out of there fast. I should have stayed away. Any sensible person would have. But I kept thinking about those perfect circles of ramps and the rich, dark soil. As a botanist, I had to understand what was happening. I came back 3 days later, this time bringing my camera and soil testing kit. I wanted proof of what I'd seen before I reported anything to my supervisor. The hollow felt different in the morning light. Peaceful, almost welcoming. The ramp circles were still there, but now there were more of them. Someone, or something, had been busy. I was taking pictures when I heard voices coming up the trail. 2 men I recognized from town, Billy Cruz and his brother Jake. They were carrying burlap sacks and digging tools. Ramp hunters. Morning.
Cat,
Billy called out as they approached.
heard you been poking around down here.
Just doing my job, I said. How's the ramp hunting this year? Jake shook his head. That's the thing. We can't find hardly any good patches. Used to be they grew thick as fleas down here. Now it's like something's been protecting them, keeping folks away. Protecting them how? You'll see, Billy said grimly. We walked together toward the best ramp patch, a spot where the plants had grown wild for generations. But when we got there, we found something that made my blood run cold. There was a man lying face down in the dirt. What was left of a man, anyway. The Cruz brothers backed away fast, but I forced myself to look closer. The body wore old work clothes and carried a ramp digger's tools, but his chest and back were torn open by something with massive claws. The wounds were too big to be from any bear I'd ever seen. Jesus, Cat, Billy whispered. What could do something like that? I didn't answer because I was staring at the ground around the body. The earth had been disturbed, but not randomly. The dirt was pushed into neat mounds, and fresh ramp plants had been placed on top of them, like someone was trying to bury the body under a garden. That's when we heard the sound. The same deep growling I'd heard before, but louder now, much louder. It came from somewhere deeper in the hollow, echoing off the rock walls. We need to get out of here, I said. Now. But as we turned to leave, we saw them. Claw marks on the trees all around us. Deep gouges in the bark 15 feet off the ground. Too high for any bear. Too big for any animal I knew. The growling got closer. We ran. I'm not ashamed to say it. We ran like our lives depended on it, crashing through the brush and scrambling up the trail as fast as we could go. Behind us, something roared. Not like a bear or a wildcat. Yes. 'Cause something much bigger and much angrier. I made it back to my truck, but Billy and Jake were nowhere to be seen. I waited an hour, then drove to the sheriff's office to report what we'd found. Sheriff Morrison listened to my story with a poker face. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. Cat, you're the third person this week to tell me about something big and mean living in that hollow. Problem is, nobody's seen it clear enough to say what it is. What about the body? We'll check it out, but if there's a dangerous animal in there, I'm calling in the state boys with rifles. I spent that night thinking about what I'd seen. The perfect ramp circles, the rich soil, the way the plants seemed to be thriving despite the presence of something that had killed a man. It didn't make sense, unless whatever was living in that hollow wasn't just protecting the plants, it was taking care of them. Against all common sense, I went back. But this time, I brought backup, a young ranger named Mike Torres who'd just transferred from Virginia. Mike was eager to prove himself, and he didn't believe my story about giant claw marks and mysterious plant circles. Probably just a big black bear, he said as we hiked down the trail. They get mean when they're protecting a food source. I wanted to argue, but part of me hoped he was right. A bear I could deal with. What I'd been imagining was something else entirely. We reached the hollow around noon. The place where we'd found the body was empty now. The sheriff's men had taken it away. But the ramp circles were still there, and there were more of them than before. Mike whistled low. Okay, that's weird. Plants don't grow like that naturally. We started examining the circles more closely. The soil wasn't just rich, it was different. darker than anything I'd seen before, and it had a strange smell. Sweet, but with something rotten underneath. "Look at this," Mike called from across the clearing. He was standing next to a large oak tree. Carved into the bark, about 8 feet up, were symbols. Not letters or words, but designs that looked almost like plant drawings. Leaves and roots and flowers, all arranged in patterns that reminded me of the Cherokee pottery I'd seen in museums. "Someone's been decorating," Mike said. But I was looking at the base of the tree, where the roots disappeared into that rich, dark soil. And I was starting to understand something that made my skin crawl. "Mike," I said quietly, "I don't think this is regular dirt." "What do you mean?" Before I could answer, we heard rustling in the woods behind us. Something big moving through the trees, but trying to be quiet about it. Mike pulled out his radio, but got only static. We were too deep in the hollow for the signal to reach out. "Let's head back," I said. But as we turned toward the trail, we saw something that stopped us cold. Standing between us and the path out was the biggest creature I'd ever seen. It looked like a bear, but wrong. Too tall, too wide. Its fur was black and thick, but underneath I could see muscles moving like cables. Its head was massive, with small, intelligent eyes that watched us with purpose. "Don't move," I whispered to Mike. The creature stood on its hind legs and reached up to one of the oak trees. Its claws, each one as long as my hand, carved new symbols into the bark. Fresh sap ran down like blood. Then it looked right at us and made a sound I'll never forget. Not a roar or a growl, but something almost like speech. Low and rumbling, but with a rhythm to it, like it was trying to tell us something. Mike grabbed for his gun, but I caught his arm. "Don't," I said. "It hasn't hurt us yet." The creature dropped to all fours and moved closer. As it did, I noticed something impossible. Where its feet touched the ground, small plants began to sprout, tiny green shoots pushing up through the dirt. It stopped about 10 feet away from us and made that sound again. Then it turned, but then walked deeper into the hollow, looking back once as if it wanted us to follow. "We're getting out of here," Mike said, his voice shaking. But I was fascinated. This wasn't just some large animal protecting its territory. It was trying to communicate, and somehow it was making plants grow. We backed slowly toward the trail, keeping our eyes on where the creature had disappeared, but as we reached the edge of the clearing, I looked back and saw something that changed everything. The creature was there, standing upright beside the largest ramp circle, and it was arranging plants. Carefully, deliberately, like a gardener tending a flower bed. It looked up and saw me watching. For a moment, our eyes met across the clearing, and in that moment, I saw something that scared me more than its size or claws. I saw intelligence. Ancient, patient intelligence. And I realized that this thing, whatever it was, had been taking care of these plants for a very long time. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The creature's intelligent eyes, the way plants grew where it walked, the careful arrangement of the ramps in perfect circles. I started researching Cherokee history, looking for any stories about plant guardians or forest spirits. What I found made my blood run cold. In 1838, when the Cherokee were forced to leave their lands and march to Oklahoma, many of their medicine people refused to go. They knew things about plants that couldn't be written down, secrets passed from teacher to student for generations. One story kept appearing in different forms. A Cherokee botanist named Thomas Ridge, who swore he would never let the white settlers destroy the sacred plants. When soldiers came to take him away, he disappeared into the deep hollows of the mountains. Some said he died there. Others said he became something else, something that would protect the plants forever. Was still reading when my phone rang. It was Sheriff Morrison. "Cat, you need to get down here. We got a situation." 20 minutes later, I was standing in his office looking at a map, covered in red pins. 5 more attacks in the past week, Morrison said. "All ramp hunters, all in the same area where you found that first body." "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm calling in hunters from 3 counties. Whatever's in that hollow, we're going to kill it before it kills anyone else. My heart sank. When? Tomorrow morning. We're going in with dogs and rifles, going to flush this thing out. I thought about the creature's eyes, the careful way it tended the plants, the Cherokee symbols carved in the trees. Sheriff, what if you're wrong? What if it's not just some mad animal? Morrison gave me a hard look. Cat, I got 5 dead bodies and a town full of scared people. I don't care if it's King Kong. It's gotta go. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life and changed everything I believed about the natural world. I went back to Ramp Hollow alone. The creature was waiting for me in the main clearing, as if it knew I would come. In the moonlight, it looked even more massive than before, but it didn't seem threatening. It sat quietly beside the largest ramp circle, watching me approach. When I got close, it did something that nearly stopped my heart. It spoke. Not in English, but in words I somehow understood. Old words in a language that felt familiar, even though I'd never heard it before. You see, it said in that deep, rumbling voice. You understand? I found my voice. Thomas Ridge? The creature's massive head nodded slowly. I was Thomas Ridge. Now I am the guardian. I keep the sacred plants safe from those who would destroy them. The sheriff is coming tomorrow with guns. I know, but I cannot leave. This is my purpose, my promise. I looked around at the perfect circles of ramps, at the rich soil that I now realized was fertilized by more than just natural decay. How long have you been here? Since the soldiers came, since my peon. People were forced to walk the trail of tears. I chose to stay, to become what was needed. You're killing people. The creature's eyes flashed with pain. Only those who come to steal, who would strip the land bare for profit. The others, the ones who take only what they need, I let them go. I thought about the commercial ramp operations that had been moving into the area. Big companies that hired crews to dig up entire patches and sell them to restaurants in the cities. There's another way, I said. I can help protect this place legally, make it a preserve. Thomas Ridge, the guardian, considered this. You would do this? For plants you cannot fully understand? For the Cherokee knowledge they represent? For the balance you've maintained here? The creature stood and walked to the edge of the clearing. With one massive claw, it drew symbols in the dirt, plant diagrams more complex than anything in my botany textbooks. These plants, it said, they are more than food. They are medicine. They are memory. They hold the knowledge of my people. I looked at the diagrams, trying to memorize them. Teach me. The guardian turned to face me. In the moonlight, its features seemed almost human for a moment. The price is high, it said. To truly protect this place, you must become part of it, as I did. I heard dogs barking in the distance. The hunting party was coming early. I accept, I said. What happened next is hard to explain in ways that make sense to people who weren't there. The guardian placed one massive paw on my forehead, and suddenly I could see the forest the way it did. Every plant was connected. Every root system was part of a larger network. The ramps weren't just growing wild. They were part of an ancient agricultural system that the Cherokee had maintained for centuries. I could feel the pain of every plant that had been carelessly harvested, the slow death of the soil when the balance was disrupted. And I understood why Thomas Ridge had chosen to become something other than human to protect it. The knowledge flowed into me like water into a dry riverbed. Not just plant names and uses, but deeper understanding. The Cherokee way of seeing the forest as a living community instead of just a collection of resources. When it was over, I was different. Not physically changed like Thomas Ridge, but connected to the hollow in ways I couldn't explain. I could feel when plants were healthy or sick. I could sense when someone entered the area with harmful intentions. The hunting party arrived at dawn, but they found nothing except an empty clearing and some unusual ramp circles. The guardian had vanished deeper into the mountains, taking his secrets with him. But not all his secrets. I used my scientific credentials and the plant knowledge I'd gained to get Ramp Hollow designated as a protected botanical preserve. No more commercial harvesting. No more strip mining the ancient plant communities. The official report said that habitat protection was necessary to preserve rare Appalachian plant species. I never mentioned Thomas Ridge or the Cherokee medicine knowledge hidden in the soil. That was 10 years ago. I still work as a forest ranger, but now I split my time between regular duties and maintaining the preserve. The ramp circles are still there, though most people who see them assume they're just an unusual natural formation. Sometimes, late at night when I'm checking on the hollow, I catch glimpses of movement in the deep woods. A shadow too large to be a bear, too purposeful to be coincidence. Thomas Ridge is still out there, still guarding the sacred plants, and I'm still learning from the knowledge he shared with me that night. People ask me sometimes if I ever get scared, working alone in the deep forest. I tell them no, but that's not entirely true. I'm not scared of what lives in these woods. I'm scared of what would happen if it wasn't there to protect them. Some gardens are tended by guardians older too, our civilization. And some promises are kept long after the people who made them have been forgotten by history. The Cherokee knew this. Thomas Ridge knew this. Now I know it too, and I'll keep their secret until the day I die.